Chapter 331, Chapter 328 Sleeping Pharaoh, Apocalypse's Reward. Luke noticed something was wrong when the spatial coordinates were disrupted. He could have instantly opened a portal with his reaction speed and avoided the phase shift without any problem. Instead of doing this, Superman, like a predator at the top of the food chain, took the initiative to step into the trap launched by Kang the Conqueror before his death. He was curious about what kind of strong enemy the other party could find for him. In the current era, on this planet, the only people who could get Superman to treat them seriously were, probably, the Ancient One and Odin. Kang the Conqueror couldn't call some Omega mutants, or a Sentinel, or Hulk from the future, to arm wrestle him. Oh, so that's how it is. After a casual glance at the ancient Egyptian pyramid, Luke quickly figured out Kang the Conqueror's plan. If I remember correctly, he and Apocalypse have always been sworn enemies. Seeing the ancient Egyptian pyramid, Luke's first thought was the god of mutants, Apocalypse. Kang the Conqueror once impersonated an Egyptian pharaoh and had a personal grudge against Apocalypse. Through the phase shift, Superman was brought into a pyramid. What he wanted to do was self-evident. Using me as a knife to kill someone else. But why would Apocalypse do what Kang wanted? However, this is a strong opponent. Luke curled his lips. As early as the time he met the Black King, Sebastian Shaw, he had heard of Apocalypse's great name. The latter, whose real name was En Sabina, was born in the 1st century of ancient Egypt and was the first mutant in Earth's history. Even Selene, the Black Queen, the witch with a long lifespan who was active in the Roman Empire, hadn't been around as long as the other party. As for Kang the Conqueror and Apocalypse, there was a feud between them. It goes back to a very early time, during the first dynasty of ancient Egypt when Kang the Conqueror pretended to be a pharaoh and ruled the country with great power. Apocalypse was just an abandoned baby, adopted by a wanderer. As a futurist familiar with the plot, Kang took a fancy to Apocalypse's great potential. Therefore, he intended to control the other party, accept him as a younger brother, and train him as the #1 messenger and fighter. But unfortunately, in this process, Kang messed up and unfortunately overturned everything. He was regarded as an enemy by Apocalypse. After awakening his ability, Apocalypse led the Egyptian people to overthrow Kang the Conqueror's cruel rule. When the latter saw that the situation was bad, he fled in panic. This incident had always been a source of shame and humiliation for Kang the Conqueror. Apocalypse never forgot him and always wanted to take revenge on Kang the Conqueror. Since then, the two had been at odds and hated each other. Kang the Conqueror, to defeat Luke, actually looked for Apocalypse and woke him up. It can be seen that his resentment against Superman had surpassed his old rival in a short time. I'm obviously a good guy. Kang the Conqueror is the villain. Luke shook his head, not understanding what Kang's hatred for him was all about. He was the light of the righteous path, the beacon of light on the earth. An absolutely positive role, a superhero. Was there anything wrong with killing a villain like Kang the Conqueror? It clearly fitted the standard ending of a popular Hollywood movie. Apocalypse, worthy of being the god of mutants. Luke's mind wandered as he walked towards the bottom of the pyramid. He could clearly feel the dormant, sleeping, but still strong and abundant life energy. Apocalypse was there. And he was gradually waking up. That horrible oppressive atmosphere, like a volcano, suddenly erupted, causing a sense of suffocation. Luke didn't choose to leave but continued down. He still had the leisure to observe the architectural structure and cultural characteristics of the pyramid. Along the way, the murals and reliefs he saw were well preserved. The Egyptians looked like they were doing a robotic dance, with animal feathers or bones on their heads as ornaments. Or holding a spear and hunting beasts. Or hold rituals and worship the gods. The vivid murals depicted several aspects of ancient times. Then again, the pyramids of ancient Egypt emerged as one of the 7 wonders of the world because of Kang the Conqueror. As a future man, he built the pyramids while posing as a pharaoh. Pyramids and sphinxes were all the creative things he brought up. Later, Kang the Conqueror was overthrown by apocalypse. Part of it was caused by spectacles and misunderstanding of the country. Boom! Boom! The thunderous sound spread far and wide. The further down he went, the more Luke could feel a strong pressure. Like sticky glue in the air, each step was a struggle for a normal person. The energy radiated out, illuminating the dimly enclosed space. Is this the god of mutants? Luke stepped into the white hall, and from a distance, he saw a tall man lying on a stone platform with an intricate circuit carved into it. The other's skin was grey, lips were blue, and solid muscles like steel, exposed without any covering. Thump thump. Thump thump thump. The sound of a strong, powerful heartbeat resembled the beating of a giant drum. He looks like Thanos with a different skin. Luke spat. The body was bathed in the glow of energy. The strong and tall Apocalypse was indeed similar to Thanos, the Titan. Who is? A thick voice echoed through the hall. Sensing an intruder, the grey figure slowly sat up. When he stood up, the gilded stone platform turned to dust. Then, it was as if a big invisible hand molded it. It turned into metal battle armor. This powerful ability to manipulate matter was powerful enough to beat the Black King Sebastian Shaw, Mr. Sinister, and other alpha-level mutants. Did you wake me up? Apocalypse, the oldest mutant on Earth, woke up. He opened his eyes and looked at the tall figure standing at the door, with strange emotions flashing in his eyes. This isn't Nathaniel Essex, the human who volunteered to be a slave. In this world, there was no one but Nathaniel who knew where he slept. The great En Sabina. Luke insincerely addressed with honorifics. Someone else woke you up from the deep sleep. His name is Kang the Conqueror, a man of the future. Boom. When Luke mentioned Kang the Conqueror, Apocalypse, who was still in a sleepy state, immediately widened his eyes, and his anger flared. The terrifying energy impacted the void and shook the huge pyramid. It was evident how deep the hatred for that damned bastard was embedded in Apocalypse. Where is he? Apocalypse clenched his fists, and his eyes radiated cold light. He was just waiting for Luke to say where Kang was and immediately go punch his enemy's head off. Great En Sabina, Kang the Conqueror is dead. Luke replied. Did you do it? Apocalypse was surprised and then asked again. Yes, he and I happen to have some personal grudges. Luke nodded his head. Very good. The cold grey face of Apocalypse revealed a rare smile. He took a step forward and slowly rose into the air. The stone pillars and frescoes in the main hall were reorganized into a stone throne in a matter of moments. Apocalypse sat on it, like a king and a god who ruled everything. Looking down at Luke below, he generously asked, So, human, what reward do you need? I can make you a noble mutant, give you extraordinary abilities, and allow you to follow by my side. This was Apocalypse thinking. He used to be a pharaoh and a deity and had been worshipped by the world. Therefore, it was a great honor to be able to follow him. Besides, according to Apocalypse, human beings were extremely backward on the evolutionary level, quite behind, and completely inferior to mutants. It was a great reward to turn a human being into a mutant. Sorry, I don't need these gifts, Great En Sabina. Luke lacked any interest and directly refused. He had nothing in common with this old man, who had been sleeping for too long and had a rigid mind. Oh, I haven't experienced the taste of being rejected for a long time, Apocalypse said in anger. He was a noble pharaoh and a great god. Others had always begged and catered to him. But this human in front of him actually showed an uninterested look. Outrageous. My reward will never be taken back, Apocalypse said in a deep voice. Energy radiated out and enveloped Luke, who was standing in place. When he first met Mr. Sinister, Nathaniel Essex, the latter knelt on the floor, almost licking Apocalypse's shoes, before getting the opportunity to become a mutant. How could this man refuse him? Apocalypse wouldn't allow it. The energy glow attempted to penetrate Luke's body and transform him into a mutant. However, the latter directly opened his bioforce field and isolated the powerful energy glow. Who are you? Apocalypse was shocked, and his eyes glowed brightly. Since you asked in good faith, then I'll. Luke hadn't mentioned his history yet. The pyramid shook violently as if there was an earthquake. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 24 comments. Vote. Chapter 332, Chapter 329 Tomb Raiders, Two Sons. Ancient Egypt, one of the four ancient civilizations. It was located in northeastern Africa, in the middle and lower reaches of the Nile River, which was now the Middle East. This place could be summarized as one ancestor, two ethnic groups, three displacements, and four wars. Because of its special geographical location, it was the transportation hub between the East and West. Coupled with religious and cultural differences, this area was in a chaotic state all year round. Of course, there were also reasons for the interference and meddling of large nations. Most people's impression of ancient Egypt was probably the dark and rustic temple buildings, the magnificent pyramids, and the mysterious sphinxes. In fact, in addition to the above, the earliest mutant organization also appeared here. Compared with Europe and North America, the Middle East, where 3 religions and 9 streams were mixed and lived in groups, was actually a place where it was more convenient for someone to hide and receive less rejection and persecution. In addition, the oldest mutant on Earth, Apocalypse, was born in ancient Egypt. After he became a noble pharaoh, he turned all the loyal guards around him into mutants. Later, Apocalypse fell into a deep sleep and was gradually forgotten. But those who were transformed into mutants continued to develop their compatriots and grow in power. In the Middle East, every warlord or religious leader possessed some kind of power. More or less, they had several mutants as secret weapons in their hands. Turn back the clock to 20 minutes ago. Outside the pyramid. In the endless desert of yellow sand. A team of people was actively carrying out excavation work. Looking at how they were dressed, they looked like a merchant caravan walking through the desert. But judging from their behavior, they were more like a group of tomb raiders. A pyramid was the tomb of ancient Egyptian kings, and these rulers were historically referred to as pharaohs. Due to the profound influence of religious culture, the ancient Egyptians developed a deep-rooted concept of an afterlife. They believed that the earthly world was only a temporary dwelling and that eternity could only be achieved after death. Therefore, every ancient Egyptian, especially the noble class, would carefully prepare their graves to gain eternal life after death. The pyramids of the pharaohs' tombs, signifying the stairway to heaven, were naturally even more magnificent. When they died, they would use various precious jewels and antiques as funerary objects. Those rulers enjoyed great honor during their lifetime, and after their death, they were eager to bring their power and glory to the underworld. They just didn't know that using a magnificent building like the pyramids as tombs could not only demonstrate their own power and majesty but also attract an endless stream of tomb raiders. For example, right now. Are you sure it's here? A brash man with a beard frowned and asked. I'm looking for Pharaoh's tomb, just like Tutankhamun's tomb. One that will make a lot of money for us. Tutankhamun was also an Egyptian pharaoh. His tomb was located in the Valley of the Kings and was later discovered by a British archaeologist. The funerary objects inside were priceless. Just the gold mask, which weighed 10 kilograms and was inlaid with various precious stones, could be auctioned at a sky-high price. According to statistics, museums valued some of the antiques and gold excavated as much as £6.5 billion. It's an astronomical amount, enough to make anyone crazy. Since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, the archaeologists who participated in the exploration work became rich overnight and attracted countless envious eyes. Correspondingly, the Valley of the Kings, which was dedicated to the burial of Pharaoh and his concubines, was also full of dugout holes. Any place where there might be treasure buried had been enthusiastically visited by grave robbers. Caliban is not lying. I can feel that there's a pyramid underneath that hasn't been discovered. It's buried underground. A bald man, who looked like he had albinism, said in a positive tone. His name was Caliban, and he was an alpha mutant. With excellent sensory abilities, not only can he detect nearby compatriots but also survey the terrain. He could be called a human radar. I hope you didn't make a mistake. The bearded man said with a warning. Archaeological work in Egypt had been one of the hottest investments in recent years. Many wealthy aristocrats liked to look for archaeologists and sponsor them in looking for pharaohs' tombs. If they succeeded once, they would be rewarded with a great deal of money. Just like the great voyages that once prevailed, when royalty sponsored voyagers who discovered new lands and brought back gold and spices. Caliban doesn't make mistakes. The bald man seemed to be afraid of the sun and covered himself with a hood. He was one of the most famous black market dealers and intelligence brokers in the Middle East. As a mutant, he wasn't discriminated against but also prospered. Dig down, and you will definitely be surprised. Caliban hid in the shadows. In his perception, there was a magnificent pyramid underground. Judging from the size and scale, it was definitely not much worse than Tutankhamun's tomb. His deal with the bearded man was to find the other man a pyramid tomb that grave robbers hadn't visited. He could get a generous reward, as well as protection from private armed forces. The bearded man was a major warlord in the Middle East, and the employer behind him was even more mysterious. They belonged to the class of people Caliban couldn't offend. Found it. Someone dug up the entrance to the pyramid. It's sealed from the inside. We can only use explosives to open it. When the bearded man heard that the entrance was sealed, there was a hint of joy in his eyes. This meant that tomb raiders hadn't visited it, and the tomb was still intact, like a virgin. Blast it! Blow it up! The bearded man shouted. He was employed by an organization in England that specialized in finding ancient relics, such as pyramids and pharaohs' coffins. Some rich and powerful Englishmen seemed to be interested in mystical forces. Whenever there was news in this area, they would contact him and actively provide a lot of manpower and material resources. "Well done, Caliban. You really are useful." The bearded man was very pleased and didn't hesitate to praise. Soon, the explosives were laid out. Boom boom. Boom boom boom. A huge sound exploded out, shaking up the gravel on the ground. The entrance to the interior of the pyramid had been unsealed. "Send in a team first. Check out the situation," the bearded man commanded. To prevent tomb raiders from destroying tombs and disturbing the pharaoh's sleep. Some pyramids were designed with various mechanisms at the beginning of their construction. After the uninvited guests met their deaths, there were stories of Pharaoh's curse, ghost hauntings, and other such frightening stories. If we can find some good things, the Englishman should be a bit more generous. The bearded man had a good dream. A local warlord like him might have a better future if he could please that Englishman. Wait. A few minutes later, hiding in the shadows, Caliban's face slightly changed, as if he had sensed something. A flash of fear rose in his eyes. He rushed to the bearded man's side. Ignoring the scorching sunlight, he urgently said, "Get out of here. There's someone inside." Someone inside. The pyramids were tombs of the pharaohs. In addition to mummies and dried corpses, what else could there be? The bearded man's question was still stuck in his throat when the ground suddenly shook, far greater than the movement caused by explosives. Gravel, like running water, kept rolling and forming swirls of varying sizes. Boom! The pyramid, which was buried in the ground, suddenly rose. The terrifying pressure, which seemed to flow down like a waterfall, made everyone in the crowd feel as if they were smothered. The magnificent pyramid rose from the ground and revealed its true face. Immediately after, a tall figure dressed in metal battle armor, full of majesty, came out of it. Could it be Apocalypse? Caliban shivered. In his perception, the tall figure was like a huge mountain, pressing down on people, leaving them breathless. The energy glow radiated out and generated heat as if it were solid. Just like the sun god in ancient Egyptian mythology, people couldn't help but feel as if they needed to kneel down and worship. Caliban immediately thought of the legendary Apocalypse, the oldest mutant on Earth. He couldn't think of any other mutant who could possess such a terrifying aura except for him. But why is there another one? Trembling, Caliban slowly knelt down. His inner shock hadn't calmed down as he felt another powerful existence. The man radiated an energy glow that wasn't much worse than that of Apocalypse, a majestic aura like an erupting volcano. For a moment, it was as if two suns had appeared in the sky. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 25 comments. Vote. Chapter 333. Chapter 330. This man's strength is not inferior to mine. In Caliban's mental world, the power of Apocalypse was like a destructive storm. Abusive and changeable, chaotic and strong. Full of ruthlessness and coldness, which felt daunting. And the other person, like a celestial body, shined brightly. Its energy structure was stable and orderly, extending from the core outward, deep and wide. In a word, they were both powerful individuals who existed beyond imagination. Why did they both suddenly appear? Caliban was like an ostrich, shrinking in the shadowy corner. He couldn't wait to dig a hole and bury himself to avoid being affected by the collision of two terrible forces. For a mutant with excellent perception and outstanding mental ability, the mere presence of those two was overwhelming. Not to mention how intense the actual encounter would be. "This is a god." The bearded man opened his mouth wide in shock as he said so. Apocalypse, which made a grand entrance, stood in midair with open hands. The magnificent pyramid was rising from the ground beneath his feet. The hot sun shining brightly behind him gave the metal battle armor a layer of golden brilliance. Such scenes reminded the bearded man of ancient Egyptian myths, the legendary pharaoh's curse, the mysterious power of pyramids, and so on. Subconsciously, the warlord thought that his reckless act of blowing open the entrance angered the sleeping pharaoh. It revived the ruler of ancient Egypt from the land of the dead. "Faisal, bring me the rocket launcher." Generally speaking, mortals who witnessed this miracle would inevitably crawl to the ground and beg the gods for forgiveness. But unfortunately, the bearded man was a staunch and determined materialist. In the midst of these phenomena, the thought that came to his mind was to find a way to shoot at this opponent. Even if a pharaoh really came back to life, a decaying mummy shouldn't be feared. Over the years, the bearded man had excavated more than a handful of tombs and opened more than a few coffins. Yes, boss. A few privately armed men, with quick hands and feet, carried the 60mm M1 rocket launcher. As seasoned tomb raiders, it was normal for them to bring a rocket launcher with them. Swoosh! They fought the mysterious forces of ancient Egypt with hot weapons. Overcome superstition with science. This group of raiders had such thoughts. Without hesitation, they directly fired. Several rockets with flaming tails bombarded Apocalypse, who was standing in midair. Small human beings and their backward weapons. Apocalypse turned up his eyes. This was one of the external manifestations of how he activated his abilities. The few rockets that came whistling immediately appeared as if they were caught in a sticky glue. They slowly stopped in midair and turned around. Boom boom. Boom boom boom. The flames of the explosion turned into a rolling wave of heat. The rockets didn't hit the bearded man and blow him to pieces but were suddenly detonated instead. Why should the great En Sabana, the former pharaoh, have to inflict his anger on mortals? A sturdy figure broke through the tumbling sea of fire and appeared in front of the crowd. Luke was thinking about how to deal with Apocalypse. The other party was the strongest among the mutants, and undoubtedly a strong opponent. He didn't have the Phoenix Force, like the Omega-level mutant, Jean Grey. Even if Magneto and Professor X joined hands, they still might not be able to resist either. Generally speaking, strong people like Apocalypse were unwilling to communicate in a friendly manner and listen to reasoning. He had a way of doing things and a worldview that no ordinary person could shake. Because he was abandoned in the desert as a child, then discovered and adopted by nomadic people nearby, Apocalypse firmly believed in the natural law of survival of the fittest and was an extreme racist. Roughly speaking, there was no difference between Hitler, Sebastian Shaw, and Magneto. Promoting the supremacy of mutants and passion about the cruel and tragic war, identifying the strong from the weak. Therefore, at the ideological level, Luke was bound to fail in negotiating and wouldn't be able to reach a consensus with Apocalypse. This was perhaps the main reason why Kang the Conqueror woke Apocalypse in a desperate attempt to create a formidable enemy for Superman. They were natural enemies. In addition to fighting and destroying, there were no other means. Why would a strong man like you care about humble ants? Apocalypse looked at the intruder who broke into the pyramid and disturbed his sleep. I used to be one of them. Luke shrugged his shoulders and spoke lightly. But you're not one now. Apocalypse spoke eloquently. When ants evolve wings, they will no longer be in the company of their fellow ants who crawl on the ground. His evaluation of this stranger had been lowered down a notch. A guy who retained superfluous feelings and didn't recognize his own existence. He could only be regarded as a rival, not a strong enemy. Ants grow wings, but they're still ants. Luke curled his lips and sarcastically said, if you're blindly arrogant and inflated inside because you're a little stronger, that would be truly ridiculous. You can't see yourself clearly. Superman's words made Apocalypse's grey face reveal a touch of anger. As a noble pharaoh and a revered god, no one had ever dared to defy him. But Luke had repeatedly touched his bottom line today. Perhaps you are strong among the humans. Apocalypse's patience ran out. He stepped forward, and the void shook. But when it comes to gifted mutants, it's not even close. The former pharaoh had great confidence in his own racial superiority. Luke's mouth twitched. He wanted to say that he hadn't only beaten mutants but also slept with mutants. No differences were found in the physical form or in other areas. Sure enough, I can't communicate properly with a racist. Luke's eyes were slightly condensed. The radiant energy around his body gradually occupied half of the void between them, competing with Apocalypse. Survival of the fittest. This is the law of nature and the true meaning of the path to evolution. Apocalypse was full of confidence, looking down on the earth. At the sight of Caliban, who was trembling, a look of disgust rose in his eyes. When I was a child, I was abandoned in the heat of the desert. Later, I was forced to become a slave, wandering on the edge of life and death every day. No one thought I would survive and grow up well. But I did it. And became the strongest of them all. I became a god. A great ruler. Apocalypse clenched his fist, his voice was cold. The magnificent pyramid, under his terrifying power, was instantly turned into powder. After that, those tiny particles of dust quickly transformed into fist-sized thunderbolts and bombarded the opposite side. Tens of millions of spherical lightning, like energy shells dropped by bombers, covering every inch of space Luke was in. If Apocalypse made a move, it would be a shocking move. The world you want to create is hopeless and meaningless. Luke's eyes gathered crimson light. The high-temperature energy formed a dense net while it abruptly spread. Power dominates everything, and the weak shouldn't survive. This is more like a brutal choice made by a reckless man with no power at all. After his return, he visited Dr. Zola to complete the long-awaited transformation experiment. Woden's blood gave Superman a more detailed and microscopic approach to energy manipulation. Boom boom. Boom boom boom. Terrifying thunder and lightning, hitting the raging high-temperature energy, immediately triggered an extremely violent explosion. In a flash, sand and stones were flying. The sky was covered. A thunderous boom came from high above, one after another. It was endless. The exuberant heat melted the sand and gravel into crystallized particles. Then, they all fell down like a hailstorm. Caliban hid on the ground below, along with the bearded warlord. Faced with the horrific scene of a natural disaster and doomsday, they could only shrink their necks and embrace each other in silence. The bearded man had just witnessed with his own eyes, one of his men was affected by the violent energy wave, and in an instant, their flesh turned into powder. Not to mention the corpse, even the ashes were blown away, nothing was left. Is that all? Luke's voice cut through the wind and sand. Just as he finished speaking, a grey fist came crashing down. Once again, Apocalypse took a step. The spatial scope seemed to shorten, and he instantly appeared in front of Superman. The strong and powerful fist, like a cannonball out of the cannon, came straight on, bringing up the suffocating pressure of the wind. Luke narrowed his eyes. He sensed the terrible power contained in this heavy punch. Then, he raised his brow. His right hand clenched into a fist and struck out with the same gesture. Boom! The atmosphere exploded, and the originally calm energy storm swept through once again. As soon as the two fists collided, the powerful force with different natures spread into a strong shock wave. The storm swept the dust and blew up the sand and gravel, forming a massive sandstorm. And the two people in the center involuntarily took a few steps back. It seems that I underestimated you. After the exchange, Apocalypse changed his attitude and began to take him seriously. He believed that his opponent's strength might be on par with his own. Binge. Weekly mass release. For every 300 votes, one extra chapter tomorrow. Please vote for this book. Comment. 27 comments. Vote. Chapter 334, Chapter 331 Saving Reputation, Verbal Warning. If he knew what Apocalypse was thinking, Luke would definitely say, "Be confident and remove the word maybe from your vocabulary." Or, "Be more confident and swallow the whole sentence back." Apocalypse's power was in its various natural abilities. But Luke was like a warrior with strength, defense, stamina, and vitality at full capacity, and from time to time, he could throw a few magic spells. It was almost impossible for him to beat Superman down. Therefore, Luke wasn't afraid of his opponent but took the initiative to fight. As for Apocalypse's blind arrogance, it was completely understandable that an old man, who had been asleep for so long, would not adapt to the changes in the outside world and develop such an arrogant attitude. Luke had seen quite a few similar guys. For example, Namor, the Sea King, had suffered a broken back. In the beginning, he also thought highly of himself and looked down on people. After some physical persuasion and consensus, the two sides got along quite happily. Therefore, throwing punches was probably the most effective way to deal with the jerk who couldn't communicate properly. "Your arrogance is limiting your vision, En Sabiner." Luke addressed Apocalypse by name, with no respect. He walked forward, and the void trembled beneath his feet. "How long have you been alive?" 50 years. 100 years. How can a human being with a short life expectancy talk about vision? The mutant god was not to be outdone and still met him fearlessly. The battle kicked off again. Violent shocks, terrifying energy, continuous explosions. The two sides tried their best to show their control of energy, from macro to micro, each using their own methods and skills. Apocalypse continuously crushed matter and then transformed and reorganized them at the molecular level, causing terrible damage. Dust turned into flames, airflow into blades. Defensive energy attacks poured onto the enemy's body. Without the bioforce field and Superman's body, Luke wouldn't be able to survive. After being transformed by Woden's blood, he didn't only use heat vision. He started to use a subtler way to compress energy and manipulate matter. He had a ball of lightning, and high-temperature chains, all around his body. Like a turret of unlimited firepower, violently pushed out. Two powerful people, both standing above the earth, were fighting against each other. To the outside world, they used power to collide in the macro world and affect the micro world. People only saw strong flashes of light, the earth-shattering destruction of matter. However, no sound was heard. Whether it was a towering mountain or a huge building complex. As long as it was affected by the wave, it would immediately disappear. The intensity of the battle was increasingly terrifying. Superman and Apocalypse, like two gods walking on Earth, were deeply feared. The battlefield between the two continued to expand, fighting all the way from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, spanning thousands of miles. Along the way, like a tornado, only broken walls and rubble were left. This is a hostile attack. What? Is that Superman? Forget it, I'll find a shelter to hide in. On the battlefield, Iran's government, which was newly established, flew into a rage. They thought, the country needs dignity and sovereignty, so how can we tolerate two bastards doing whatever they want? The king wanted to mobilize the army immediately, but he decisively gave up his original idea after finding out that one of them was Luke. That was the war hero who tore the Axis powers apart, split them up, killed the mustached Fuhrer, and ended World War II. The Soviet Union, one of the superpowers, was afraid of Superman's strength. They decided to develop the nuclear industry to cope with the possible crisis. So, Iran decided not to poke their noses into this and provoke this great god. It was better to continue as if nothing had happened. If this battle continues, nothing good will come out of it. A few hours later, the violent energy blew away the clouds. With a hard punch, Apocalypse flew out several miles, with a trace of shock in his eyes. He didn't expect that a human being could really stand up to him. Mind manipulation, matter reorganization, energy absorption, space transfer. Apocalypse had used all the above natural abilities. Combined with the fighting experience and fighting instinct cultivated with the nomadic people since childhood, he still didn't have the upper hand. The opponent appeared to be at ease, not showing fatigue but rather an increasing sense of courage. The momentum kept rising. The power released between the punches and kicks was even greater than before, frightening people. What? Going to beg for mercy? Luke returned the taunt. This was far from his limit. To quote Captain America's classic line, "I can do this, all day." With a young yellow sun, even Superman didn't quite know where his upper limit was. You're overconfident, human. Although he acknowledged the other's strength in his heart, Apocalypse would never say it. Fighting and not being able to beat him were two different things. Anyway, in terms of momentum, he wasn't much worse. Then, continue. Luke raised an eyebrow. It was rare for him to find a formidable opponent to train with. After being officially promoted to the All-Father level, Wolverine and Sabretooth, the two mutant brothers who could still serve as sandbags, had announced their formal retirement. Apocalypse, which had an almost immortal body, had become a suitable replacement. If the other party didn't stop, Luke didn't mind fighting for a few more hours. You can't kill me, at least without paying a certain price. Apocalypse cleared his throat and changed the subject. Because of his grey skin, it was impossible to see whether this mutant god felt embarrassed. Continuously fighting won't be a problem for us. Apocalypse continued. He had a powerful gift for absorbing energy. Luke seemed to have mastered a similar method. In addition, the two were physically powerful in close combat. Conventional weapons couldn't harm them. No solid results could be achieved if the fight continued. Instead of wasting energy and time, it's better just to stop. Apocalypse narrowed his eyes and waited for an answer. He finally woke up from a deep sleep, and he still had many plans to carry out, and there was no need to spend energy on Luke. Considering that there's nothing personal between us, there's really nothing to settle. Luke pondered for a moment and smiled lightly. I don't have anything against stopping this fight, it's just, I would like to correct one of your thoughts, Great En Sabina. He raised his right hand, and a silver light shone, turning into a long sword and pointing it straight at his opponent. The silver-like 10th metal was aimed at Apocalypse from afar. The sharp coldness that cut through everything almost forcefully touched his face. It caused the latter's eyelids to jump. Danger. The word flashed in Apocalypse's mind. I have the ultimate means to hurt and kill you, Luke said with a straight face while holding the sharp sword. So, I personally hope you could be more peaceful and not think about establishing a mutant empire and exterminating the backward human race. Instead of wasting your time on this meaningless magnificent endeavor you have been sleeping for thousands of years, why not travel around and take a break? Luke started with a stern verbal warning and then changed his tone to gentle advice like a life coach. In his opinion, every villain should learn from Thanos. If one had nothing to do, he could just plant fields, bask in the sun, and feel the tranquility and beauty brought by the countryside life. Always thinking about ruling the world, building nations, destroying people, such a life pursuit was rather dull. Humph. We'll meet again. Apocalypse, who hated being threatened, looked at the sharp sword and held back his anger. Reason told him that he should keep a generous heart. No matter how rude, cocky and arrogant this human being was, he was a magnanimous pharaoh and a kind god, so there was no need to haggle over every ounce. After some psychological consolation and self-assurance, Apocalypse dropped a malicious sentence, started space transmission, and left. He was going to find his 4 knights. Gain more power. And then come back to settle the score with Superman. Lose the soldiers but not the battle. The mutant god still wants to save his reputation. Luke faintly smiled. He put away the 10th metal. This thing wasn't limitless, so he had to use it wisely. Just now, he took it out as a deterrent. Superman was a little reluctant to use it to cut someone down. Comment. 14 comments. Vote. Chapter 335, Chapter 332 Prodigium, Mummy. Extra burger. I can't believe I survived. Caliban shoved away the thick debris covering his body and poked his head out. After making sure that the 2 horrible beings were getting farther and farther away from him, he breathed a sigh of relief and felt heartfelt joy that he had managed to survive. No one thought that a grave robbery would lead to such serious consequences. The earth-shattering battle scene was still imprinted in Caliban's mind, which was completely beyond the imagination of ordinary people. Who was the other person? Caliban shook off the dust while wondering. He could sense his compatriots and identify them. The tall man in metal armor and grey skin was most likely Apocalypse, the legendary mutant god. More powerful than an Omega. In addition to Apocalypse, Caliban couldn't think of any mutant who could have such a powerful aura. He looked at the center of the battlefield. Sand and gravel were turned into glass-like crystallized particles. As if melted by high temperature, it reflected bright light. The 2 powerful men were beyond human imagination. The aftermath of their fight almost turned the desert upside down for miles around. The terrain changed dramatically, and the buildings caved in as if a natural disaster had struck. Apocalypse really exists. Caliban wrapped his robe tightly around his body. If this news got around, it would definitely cause quite a stir. Mutant organizations active in Europe and America might move to the Middle East on a large scale to meet the legendary deity. If I can find Apocalypse. Caliban sensed the value of this information. He was a mutant, and if he could successfully gain Apocalypse's recognition, maybe he wouldn't have to be bossed around by Middle Eastern warlords, and he wouldn't have to remain a nameless black market trader. A brighter future, a broader future, awaited him. What do you want from me? Just when Caliban's eyes were twinkling, and he was contemplating how to suck up to the god, a deep voice suddenly rang out. The tall figure clad in metal battle armor took a step out of the space passageway and looked down at the alpha mutant. Caliban's legs were weak and trembling. In front of Apocalypse, he was like a weak lamb. Great Sovereign, great En Sabina, great Apocalypse. I want to be your servant. As a black market trader, Caliban had a good eye. Facing Apocalypse's majestic momentum and having no support, he directly knelt down. Look pious, like a fanatical believer. A touch of satisfaction rose in Apocalypse's eyes. He hadn't woken up for long. He still enjoyed the worship of the world. Very good. My child, get up. Apocalypse slightly raised his hand and lifted Caliban up with his mind. Your name is Caliban. Do the warlords force you to find the tomb of the pharaohs? With just a quick glance, Apocalypse read the needed thoughts from Caliban's mind. He was called the god of mutants, not without reason. Apocalypse mastered most of the powerful natural abilities out there. To some extent, he was somewhat similar to Superman, both of whom were warriors without obvious flaws. Your ability is very useful to me, but far from powerful enough. Why do you want to stifle your talent, child? Bring it all out. No more resistance, no more resistance. Open yourself up to your new self. Like the leader of an offline pyramid scheme, Apocalypse used an impassioned voice and mind control to awaken Caliban's pent-up feelings of resentment. His eyes rolled up as he put his right hand on the other's head. Forces acting at the microscopic level were rapidly modifying the mutant genes in Caliban's body. The albino, sun-fearing, black market dealer. In a few breaths, it got rid of the defects rooted in his genes, and his ability reached a new level. I've been strengthened. Caliban was breathing heavily like a drowning man. He lifted his hood and the ultraviolet rays shined on his body. It no longer caused a burning sensation. His mental power was like a radar network, radiating out in a wide range. The red dots that represented mutants were reflected in his mind, one by one. The entire capital of Cairo was within Caliban's perception. This was something impossible for him before. Seek more of my people and tell my people. Apocalypse paused for a moment and then said, their god has returned. Apocalypse was busy developing believers and searching for his 4 horsemen. Luke was on his way back when he saw an archaeological team being attacked by armed men. With the battlefield moving, he and Apocalypse had long fought from Egypt to northern Iraq. After the latter proposed to stop fighting, Superman didn't intend to pursue it further. To solve Mr. Sinister and Kang the Conqueror, S.H.I.E.L.D was still waiting for him to return and rectify the order. Just as Apocalypse didn't want to waste his strength on fighting, Luke was too lazy to fight with an old antique. Flying in midair, he saw a team of camel-riding, clearly differently dressed locals, crashing into terrorists on patrol in the desert. There was a fierce gun battle between the two sides, with many bullets shooting and dust splashing. Meet acquaintances here. Luke couldn't help but stop and look down at the team. His eyes slightly condensed while a wisp of free energy bounced out like a chain of lightning. Crackle! In less than 2 seconds, all the militants were turned into a mass of charcoal and fell down. Lucian, long time no see. Luke slowly landed, placing his feet on the ground, and greeted him. In the desert of northern Iraq, he actually met Lucian, the Lycan leader. Perhaps this was a special destiny. General Cavill. Lucian was surprised too. After Superman disappeared, he still kept in touch with Shield. Selene, who went to North America, had established herself in New York, Boston, Detroit, and other places and turned it into a solid base camp. On the other hand, Lucian was in charge of the European continent to provide solid support for the future construction of the Magic Congress. I just contacted Howard Stark an hour ago and got the news of your return. Please forgive me for not being able to meet and greet you in the first place. Lucian's attitude was quite humble. Even if he were already a Lycan leader in Europe, when he saw his master, he would still turn into a husky. Superman's speech in front of the Essex building, and the shocking killing of Mr. Sinister, were broadcast by TV stations and spread all over the world. It looked like the Red Bear of the Soviet Union would soon burst into flames. The senior officials, who had easily slept for a while, would start to panic again. Since when did werewolves take up security work? Luke ignored the looks of surprise and curiosity from the others and directly asked. He was interested because there were 4 young werewolves in this team besides Lucian, who seemed to act as bodyguards. And their employers were all human beings. This was very strange. General, I'm sorry you had to see a joke. Lucian was a little embarrassed. He was the Lycan leader of Europe, and becoming a bodyguard was too embarrassing to talk about. They are from Prodigium, a large organization with considerable strength in Europe and all over the world. If the werewolves wanted to grow, they had to create good connections with political forces. The vast majority of the people in Prodigium's group were high-ranking officials from European countries. Otherwise, Lucian wouldn't have degraded himself to act as a bodyguard. If he wanted to expand the werewolf clan, he needed the support of the upper class. Prodigium was naturally a good connection. Prodigium. Luke glanced at them, as if he understood something, and asked, "You are not looking for the tomb of the Egyptian princess Amenet, are you?" He didn't expect that the Dark Universe, which should have been a failure, would be surfacing. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 16 comments. Vote. Chapter 336, Chapter 333 Egyptian Princess, Set, I. Egyptian Princess. Lucian paused. The Prodigium group said they were looking for harem, which was the taboo knowledge referred to in the Egyptian language. There was no mention of an Egyptian princess Amenet. General, perhaps. They are hiding something from me. Lucian's eyes shone with cold light. What werewolves hated the most was deception and betrayal. He sincerely wanted to have a good relationship with Prodigium, so he didn't hesitate to come and act as a bodyguard in person. But those people treated him as a fool, intending to trick him and use him. This made the Lycan leader very angry. He felt as if he was humiliated. He silently noted down this debt in his heart. Who's the leader of this team? Luke scanned the members. Apart from Lucian and the 4 young werewolves he brought, there were over 20 people in total. Among them, the strong men who looked vigorous, armed to the teeth, and guarded the perimeter should be specially trained mercenaries. The people in the middle were probably the members of Prodigium. That man, Dr. Henry, is the leader of Prodigium. Lucian turned his attention to a middle-aged man with white sideburns and a beard. I joined the team to protect him. Luke looked around for a moment and whispered, "Take me there." With his status, no matter who it was, they had to show him some respect. Not to mention Prodigium, even if Hydra came, they had to be obedient. "Dr. Henry, this is..." Lucian brought Superman to the middle-aged man and then started his long list of titles. No matter which parallel universe, power represents power, and identity shows status, both of which are all-powerful credentials. The mysterious organization Prodigium, which Lucian described as being able to cause turmoil in Europe with many big names standing behind it, was no exception. After learning that Luke was the Superman who disappeared, the leader, Dr. Henry, immediately underwent a dramatic change in attitude. At best, he was able to influence the political climate of Downing Street in England and was considered a prominent figure. But the young man in front of him, laughing and joking with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, could influence the world's situation. The difference in level was as big as a chasm in the sky. It turned out that the previous earthquake was the aftermath of General Cavill's battle, and I thought it was a sudden meteorological change. From his appearance to his demeanor, Dr. Henry fitted the image of an old English gentleman. He spoke slowly and carefully and with good manners in speech and behavior. He was a sociable person who could easily gain the favor of others. "I haven't thanked you, General. You helped us get rid of those armed men. It's a gift that's impossible to repay." Dr. Henry spoke kindly, but there was a hint of caution in his eyes. When facing Luke, he felt a heavy pressure that almost triggered the other personality in his body. "Dr. Jekyll, do you feel distressed by the split in your consciousness?" Luke wasn't impressed by the compliments. He could tell right away that Dr. Henry was not human, not a normal human being, to be precise. In his mind's eye, beneath Dr. Henry's physical shell, there were 2 core personalities that emanated different emotional fluctuations. One was sensible, sober, and maintained goodwill. The other was cruel, violent, and full of evil thoughts. "What did you say? I don't quite understand." Although Dr. Henry tried his best to hide it, his face still revealed a strong sense of shock. He had a secret that no one else knew, another personality. "This isn't a psychological problem for you, but an after-effective, biological transformation, right?" Luke once again dropped a heavy bomb. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, how could he not have heard of it? Henry Jekyll, from Robert Louis Stevenson's short story, was the first dual personality figure in the history of literature. The story was about Henry Jekyll, a successful academic and well-known philanthropist who invented a potion. After taking it, he split his own evil personality, Edward Hyde. Such a classic image had been brought to the screen many times. In the failed Dark Universe, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were an important link between monsters. He found Amenet, the Egyptian princess, and liberated Set, the god of death. Similar to the Invisible Man, Frankenstein, Werewolf, and Dracula, they all belonged to the Dark Universe. Prodigium was a scientific organization that specialized in studying all kinds of monsters and myths. Hiding under the Natural History Museum of London, England, their nature was similar to that of Shield. Luke didn't expect that in his Earth 1024, there was still a hidden branch. Therefore, when Dr. Henry gave his name, Superman turned this man's bottom line upside down. "I know a guy in a similar situation as you." Luke patted Dr. Henry on the shoulder consolingly and smiled. Whenever he loses his temper, his body would be possessed by his angry personality. He can't control his destructive impulses and starts to wreak havoc. Dr. Jekyll, symptoms and conditions like yours aren't uncommon. I personally recommend going to Nepal, a place called Kamataj, for spiritual healing. I believe it would be very effective. The disease needs treatment. It's useless to conceal and cover up. Dr. Henry was silent, dubious, and quietly kept those key words in mind. If it were someone else, he might not even bother paying attention to them, treating them as a charlatan. But when that remark came out of Luke's mouth, the credibility was different. This was like an ordinary person saying that they don't like money, have never touched a penny, and money can't buy you happiness. Most people would scoff at it. And for some rich people, that feeling was very different. For a long time, Dr. Henry suffered from the pain of having a split personality. As long as the evil personality named Edward Hyde appeared, he couldn't restrain his inner desire to kill. Therefore, he had committed many murders and had remained an extrajudicial madman. Kamataj. Henry repeated the words. Yes, remember to quote my name. You can enjoy a 50% discount on meditation courses and have a better chance to get personal guidance from the Sorcerer Supreme to heal your soul and redeem yourself. Luke acted like a veteran salesman in the business, and his attitude was quite enthusiastic. Comment. 12 comments. Vote. Chapter 337, Chapter 334 Egyptian Princess, Set 2. Dr. Henry, a patient whose mental strength exceeded his physical capacity, thus splitting into a strong personality, was Kamataj's favorite kind of apprentice. With a little training, he would be an excellent master of the mystic arts. By the way, if you are going to look for the Egyptian Princess Amenet, I can help. Luke, seemingly unconcerned, stated the real purpose of the other party. Dr. Henry knew everything about Superman and had become accustomed to it. Considering that the other party was the leader of S.H.I.E.L.D., it wasn't surprising that they beat Prodigium's level of information gathering. You're such a generous person, General. I'm very grateful. Dr. Henry smiled. He wanted to refuse, but in the end, reason prevailed. The Egyptian Princess Amenet has always been the focus of Prodigium's research. The team continued on its way, with Dr. Henry sitting on a camel, slowly moving forward. Egypt had long been a key surveillance area for Prodigium. According to Dr. Henry, back in 1923, a young soldier named O'Connell, together with a female archaeologist, Evelyn, discovered Hamunaptra, the legendary city of the dead. And then, the resurrection of the high priest Imhotep, as well as the legions of the undead, had caused a surprising amount of commotion. Since then, Prodigium had been secretly established and developed in a low-key manner. That was the first time that Prodigium saw the mysterious power. Beneath the surface of this world, there are many things that humans have never understood and that science cannot explain. Dr. Henry lamented. We call those monsters, or dark forces. In the Natural History Museum of London, there were still two magical books, Black Book of the Dead and Golden Book of Amun-Ra, which could bring people back from the dead or detain their souls in Hades. O'Connell and Evelyn were also honorary members of Prodigium. The legendary story of these two people could have been made into several series of movies. There, it should be the place where the Egyptian princess Amenet was imprisoned. Dr. Henry pulled the reins and stopped the camel. Luke narrowed his eyes and expanded his vision to see a huge tomb buried underground. General Sir, Amenet killed the pharaoh and committed a great crime. She was erased, expelled from Egypt, and buried in northern Iraq. Dr. Henry had already informed that Amenet was the daughter of a certain pharaoh, who was to inherit the throne and rule the country. However, even though her father was old, he was vigorous. The old tree sprouted another branch and gave birth to a son. According to the Egyptian system, that baby would likely jeopardize Amenet's position. So, the ruthless and power-hungry princess obtained an extremely evil summoning ritual from the high priest. She signed a contract with Set, the god of death, to find a suitable body and bring that god to the real world. As a reward, Amenet was able to gain unprecedented strength and immortality and rule Egypt forever. She succeeded, but she also failed. Dr. Henry sighed. The Egyptian princess signed a contract with Set but failed to complete the final ceremony. Instead, she was mummified and executed for killing the pharaoh. According to my research, before she died, she got the dagger of Set. As long as she stabs it into a human body, she could use it as a medium to let the Egyptian gods return to Earth. Luke raised an eyebrow and developed an interest. There were many gods of death in the Marvel universe. Olympus had Hades. The Nordic deity was Hela, Odin's eldest daughter. And on the Egyptian side, there was Set. Even though the one who was really in charge of everyone, including everything, was in fact Lady Death. She was the embodiment of a concept, one of the 5 gods of the universe. She was also Thanos's dream goddess and Deadpool's object of affection. But on Earth, there were quite a few gods who had the power of death. You want to find Amenet, unseal her, and let her finish the contract. Luke figured out that Prodigium had other plans. Or rather, the Brits were planning to try it again and again, on the verge of death. It's not an easy game to mess with a god of death. Dr. Henry, to some extent. Like Nick Fury, the hard-boiled egg director, both loved to use trouble to solve the trouble. The consequence of doing so was often causing more trouble. Just research. I want to dissect Amenet and analyze the causes of the dark power. I'm definitely not coveting Set's divine power. Dr. Henry was afraid of Superman's misunderstanding, so he quickly defended himself. If Prodigium was recognized as a terrorist organization by the other party, it would be dissolved as soon as possible. Can you guarantee that there won't be any accidents? Luke asked. Curiosity killed the cat. Curiosity could also destroy the world. Scientists destroying the world had always been one of the traditional plots in Hollywood movies. Prodigium and his group still wanted to study the mummy of the Egyptian princess. If Set came, how would it end? So, in your opinion, what should we do, General? Dr. Henry asked. Whether it was him speaking or Superman. They were representing Prodigium and SHIELD. Both sides weren't qualified to negotiate, so they could only surrender their right to speak. I think that in order to ensure safety and avoid accidents, Luke cleared his throat and said, the Egyptian princess Amenet and the dagger of Set are better off in S.H.I.E.L.'s hands. Dr. Jekyll, as you may not know, we are preparing to set up a magic congress to handle such incidents. Isn't this daylight robbery? Henry pushed down his inner thoughts and tried to negotiate the terms. so can Prodigium participate in the research or join Magic Congress? No problem. Regarding the establishment of the Magic Congress, you can ask Lucian. The werewolves have a seat. Luke generously agreed. In the Marvel Universe, measuring strength below the level of an All-Father was to see who had the highest energy output and strong defense. Above an All-Father, it was to test the degree of manipulation at the micro level, as well as the understanding of some concepts and laws. Considering that it was possible to face the 5 gods of the universe or the living tribunal of the higher level in the future, Luke thought that there was nothing wrong with preparing in advance, such as studying the concept of power and improving yourself. Simply put, he wanted to pull the wool over Set's eyes. Here we are. The burial place of the Egyptian princess was in the northern province of Iraq. Prodigium had long established a relationship and hadn't encountered any obstacles except the group of militants they met on the road. Our mainnet is down here. Let's set up the explosives along this circle and blow up the passage. Dr. Henry jumped off the camel and began to issue orders. I don't think it needs to be that troublesome. Luke brought the map over and walked around the work site where the perimeter was set up. Roughly confirming the position, he stomped his foot. The dust tumbled up, and the ground instantly fell apart. The bioforce field exerted heavy pressure and grinded the broken soil into dust. A neat entrance path opened up. Okay. Let's go in. Luke floated in midair, calling them over, and then slowly descended into the darkness. Dr. Henry's throat rolled a few times, trying to calm his inner shock. In his opinion, perhaps the most interesting monster on this planet was Superman. Unfortunately, Prodigium would be insane if they tried to put their hands on the other party. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 23 comments. Vote. Chapter 338, Chapter 335 Princess, do you think I'm suitable? The tomb of Princess Amenet in Egypt was actually a huge underground cave. It wasn't as magnificent and large as a pharaoh's pyramid. Rather, it was very gloomy and horrible. Luke entered first, followed by Dr. Henry and his archaeological team. Lucian, the werewolf, and his compatriots had now become dispensable and unimportant. Because of Superman's existence, the magical journey that was originally frightful and full of dangers was turning into an outing and a leisurely trip. Everyone looked relaxed as they slipped down the strong nylon rope. The hollow underground chamber was filled with the sound of the wind, emitting a shrill howl like a wolf's cry. Mercury. Dr. Henry followed Luke as if he felt safer this way. A muddy drop of liquid hit his shoulder, slid down, and rolled onto his palm. Just as Emperor Qin's tomb used mercury to simulate rivers and lakes, the ancient Egyptians also used this chemical element called mercury extensively to build their tombs. In their perception, mercury could suppress the souls of the dead and also serve as a means to prevent tomb raiders from breaking in. Because it was a neurotoxin, it could damage the brain and nerve system. Many tomb raiding teams who entered a pharaoh's mausoleum and accidentally inhaled too much mercury vapor would go insane and die of madness. This was also the reason for the frightening rumors such as Pharaoh's curse and evil spirits. In that ignorant era, people often attached mysterious and grotesque explanations to unknown things they didn't understand. Mercury drips from above and then falls into these holes. Dr. Henry turned his flashlight to the ground. At regular intervals, a square hole similar to the entrance of a sewer was arranged. This means that there's a complete pipeline system in the tomb of the Egyptian princess. We can follow it to find the sarcophagus. The corners of Luke's mouth twitched slightly as he listened, thinking that Prodigium was a tomb raiding organization with extensive experience in committing crimes. Those archaeological team members who came with him, some were arranging lighting equipment, while some explored the terrain. It seemed that it wasn't their first time committing grave robbery in the name of archaeology. Even more shameful was that, according to Dr. Henry, their harvest would eventually be turned over to the country and placed in the Natural History Museum of London, a place that originally belonged to Prodigium. It was the same as insider trading. Luke could not help but feel that in terms of shamelessness or capitalism, they had a good method. This is the antechamber of the tomb, where Armanet's mummified body is located. For a while, he studied the huge statues and simple paintings that had a primitive touch. Dr. Henry rubbed his hands and pointed to a black hole. He had a hunch that this was a big discovery. Luke's vision, unaffected by the environment, scanned through the thick rocks to determine the exact location of the Egyptian princess's sarcophagus. "Do you have the dagger of Set?" He turned his head and asked. That was a key item. As an ordained sorcerer supreme, Luke's knowledge of magic wasn't too bad. He knew a little about the application and execution of contractual spells and transfer rituals. Set signed a contract with the Egyptian princess Armanet, and the ruby-encrusted dagger was an important medium. One only needed to choose the right body and then stab the dagger into the body. Set, the god of death, could be brought to life in a human body and still retain his full divine power. This was an opportunistic way to bypass the rules of the material world. In Luke's recollection, the old devil Mephisto had done something similar. The latter united with a mortal and gave birth to an heir. Then, by taking possession of that body and switching from a father to a son, he was able to use the full power of a Hell Lord in the material world. Otherwise, every time he came to the human world, he would be suppressed by the rules. We found the gem. It fell into the hands of the Crusaders and was later placed in a casket as a funerary object. Henry replied. During the Crusades, they invaded Egypt. Perhaps, they got the ruby at that time. If Prodigium hadn't discovered the ruby and found some clues about the Egyptian princess, Dr. Henry wouldn't have launched this expedition, asking the werewolves to act as bodyguards, leading to the series of subsequent events. Luke frowned and continued, "So, only Armanet herself knows where the dagger is." Dr. Henry nodded. "Otherwise, he wouldn't even think of unsealing the Egyptian princess's sarcophagus. Only when the dagger and the ruby were combined could the final ritual be completed. Fighting monsters with monsters was the policy that Prodigium was founded on. If they could study the power of death or control Armanet, they could use it for themselves. Prodigium had taken a big step on the road to darkness. What consequences? We couldn't expect a senior with serious psychological problems and an evil personality to make a wise decision. From the structure of the tomb, we can assume that Armanet was imprisoned here as a sinner. A large amount of mercury was poured over the opening of the shaft, suppressing her soul and preventing her from resting in peace or being reincarnated for eternity. Generally speaking, where the sarcophagus is located, there should be a dog-headed guardian to warn intruders. The 6 guardians were looking at the mercury shaft to suppress the dead mummy, nothing else. Dr. Henry, in his customary academic style, concluded, "Underneath, there's an evil spirit that had suffered 1,000 years of darkness, torment, and resentment." The Prodigium crew heard this and moved closer to Luke's position. The latter acted as usual. He had been to hell and bargained with the old devil. If any evil spirits and demons appeared in front of them, he could instantly send out a set of demon removal spells and send them on their way. "Take out the sarcophagus," Luke ordered. Dr. Henry observed for a while and found the opening mechanism. Rumble, rumble. With a violent sound, the underground cave started shaking. A bronze sarcophagus slowly rose and was pulled out of the mercury well by some chains. Then came the densely packed camel spiders, which felt strange, as they moved like a layer of black carpet covering the rock walls. Fortunately, they aren't scarabs. Luke curled his lips. Those things were the standard for Egyptian tombs. The bioforce field suddenly opened up and isolated the camel spiders that were crawling over. "Get a helicopter and pull the sarcophagus up." Dr. Henry deserved to be a senior member of Prodigium. He was able to get a helicopter in Iraq in no time. After thousands of years of darkness, the sarcophagus used to seal Armanet was finally revealed. Large flocks of crows hovered in midair, seemingly attracted by some mysterious force, like a gathering of dark clouds. "Set's power is beginning to show." Dr. Henry looked solemn. The crow was a symbol of death and a messenger of death. Armanet completed the summoning ritual and signed the contract, so she has immortality and can only be sealed. It looks like it won't be long before she comes back to life. Luke didn't care. Not to mention the dead Egyptian princess, even if Set appeared in front of him, it wasn't a threat. The strength of those Egyptian gods was probably similar to those dimensional demons. What Luke was actually interested in was the conceptual power of death. Although Set was only the god of death of Egypt, he couldn't control other boundaries. Asgard, Olympus, heaven, hell, all had nothing to do with him. But getting that power was equivalent to having a part of death's authority. "I wish she could wake up sooner and lead me to the dagger." Luke saw yellow sand on the horizon and heavy smoke rolling in. A huge sandstorm was coming for the helicopter. Set, seemingly unable to come down, wanted to stop Prodigium from taking away the sarcophagus of the Egyptian princess Armanet. "General, sir, then I will return to London." Dr. Henry glanced at the coffin and felt a little worried. They landed at a nearby airport where a transport plane was ready to take off. Luke was about to nod when the rusty sarcophagus with its coils of chains shook violently. The sharp sound of fingernails scratching abruptly sounded. In the distance, one could also hear a woman's crying and shouting voice. "Leave him alone." An archaeological team member with empty eyes leaned toward the coffin like a puppet, and Luke stopped Dr. Henry. The latter was thinking of bringing Armanet back to London, then conducting research to find out the dagger's whereabouts. But in Luke's opinion, it was all the same. Waking up the Egyptian princess as soon as possible seemed to be a little less work. The archaeological team members near the sarcophagus appeared to have fallen into a hallucination and were deprived of their consciousness. They uttered awkward, odd syllables and sliced through the dark chains that were wrapped around the coffin. The large murder of crows hovering in the sky was like thick clouds covering the sky, blocking the blazing sunlight overhead. A withered hand grabbed the edge of the coffin. The slender figure, wrapped in tattered cloth, slowly sat up. The mummified Egyptian princess, Armanet, came to life. She turned her head somewhat mechanically, the pair of dark eyes staring at the people there. Before Armanet could say anything to create a more frightening mood, Luke said, "Princess, do you think I am suitable? Can you be the god of death, Set's human form?" Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge-translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. // Comment. 19 comments. Vote. Chapter 339, Chapter 336 Completion of the Ritual, Death is Coming. After 1,000 years, were human beings now so direct? The Egyptian princess Amenet had just woken up. She originally wanted to use her eerie voice, with the female ghost-like appearance, to set the mood like a horror movie effect. Unexpectedly, Luke directly offered to become the mortal vessel of the god of death, Set. It was completely unconventional. Amenet froze for a moment, and her brain had just rebooted. The muddy face, branded with hieroglyphics, showed a hint of interest. She stared straight at Luke, sweeping back and forth with a look of measuring goods. Strong, young man. Amenet licked her blackened lips like a hungry female beast trying to swallow her opponent whole. There were no criteria for this Egyptian princess to choose the body of the god of death to descend upon. Simply put, it was probably the right age, not too old. The endurance should be sufficient, with strong abilities, preferably both firm and long-lasting. And, they shouldn't look too bad. The work wasn't too strict, so she could prioritize her preference. When the above conditions were met, it would pass. Don't get it wrong, this wasn't what Set had stated, but Amenet's personal interest. After all, before completing the ritual, she had to communicate with the man of her choice, spiritually and physically, to achieve great harmony. In certain places, her requirements couldn't be lowered. The great Set should be pleased with you. Amenet sashayed her waist and approached him leisurely. In her eyes, there was only Luke. Dr. Henry was too old and had been ruled out. Those werewolves were non-human. They didn't need her consideration. The rest of the archaeology team looked inadequate in front of Luke. After a rigorous screening process, the only person who met the requirements was the young man who volunteered. Really? Luke made a surprised expression as if he was excited about being elected. And then, the corners of his mouth curled up, and he softly said, "In that case, Princess, let's finish the ceremony as soon as possible. Where is the dagger of Set?" As the one who signed the contract, Amenet had a hidden connection with the ruby and the dagger. As long as it's in the vicinity, she could sense it. To Luke, the Egyptian princess was just a tool to find the dagger. Amenet was silent as she approached the young man. She sniffed the other side's vibrant soul aura and showed a satisfied look on her face. "Let me see." The Egyptian princess gently lifted Luke's shirt as if she wanted to inspect the goods first. Boom! The latter mercilessly threw a punch. There was a horrible hole in Amenet's chest. Fortunately, she was a mummy, and her internal organs had already rotted, so there was no bloody scene. "Princess, please behave yourself." Luke looked righteous. His actions told the other party that he wasn't that kind of casual guy. He just wanted to know the whereabouts of the dagger of Set, but if he had to sacrifice his body for that, it wasn't worth it. Amenet was certainly a rare beauty with an exotic look, but that was 1,000 years ago. After being mummified, she was sealed in a sarcophagus and dangled in a well full of mercury. The merciless years had destroyed her beauty, and nothing was left. The Egyptian princess standing in front of Luke hadn't had a bath in thousands of years. With flesh and blood rotting and covered in mud, it really wasn't flattering. To let Luke and such a woman achieve great harmony was something a little difficult. In a nutshell, he rejected her because of her looks. I'm only interested in Set, not in you. Armanet felt offended when she heard his answer. She became angry. She opened her hands, and the intense aura of death attracted a large number of crows. They swept in like a black storm. Thousands of crows with sharp claws and beaks pecked away at the archaeological team. Snap! Luke snapped his fingers. The exuberant energy in the air, like an explosive that had its fuse ignited, exploded violently. Boom boom! Boom boom boom! The dark crows hovering overhead suddenly burst into flames and turned into a sea of fire. This spectacular scene shocked the archaeological team members, and at the same time, they had a better understanding of Superman's strength. Most of the time, I am very polite and courteous to women. Luke walked up to Armanet and wrapped his bioforce field around his opponent, applying terrifying pressure. A mummy's body had an immortal attribute, but it was still not strong enough to be invulnerable to swords, water, and fire. At most, they were frequently beaten by physical strikes, more than normal monsters. With her two arms bursting open and exploding into a black powder, the Egyptian princess finally felt fear. Her legs bent, and she slowly fell to her knees in submission. What is wrong with this world? In Armanet's feeble mind, humans should be synonymous with weakness. Even the bravest and powerful warrior in the kingdom couldn't resist the power of the gods. But now, it seemed like something had gone wrong. The young man standing in front of her was horribly strong. That's the right attitude. Luke put away the bioforce field, looked down at the Egyptian princess who had sobered up after a beating, and asked again, "Where is the dagger of Set?" A few hours later, Luke arrived at a monastery near London, England, with a team of archaeologists from Prodigium. According to Armanet, during the Crusades, they invaded Egypt and plundered a lot of gold, jewelry, and antiques, among which was the dagger of Set. "Find it and bring it to me." Luke gave orders. The Egyptian princess, who was originally ambitious and arrogant, had been conditioned by him to be obedient. Before long, she brought back the dagger of Set from the monastery. It was made of black crystal and had a long, slender shape, and was cold to the touch. And the ruby? Luke turned to look at Dr. Henry, who quickly handed over a box. He knew that Prodigium couldn't resist Superman and SHIELD, so he changed his mind and actively cooperated, trying to leave a good impression. That Magic Congress proposal was very tempting. A huge organization in charge of the dark creatures and the underworld. If he could join, maybe Prodigium wouldn't have to worry about how to deal with those monsters. They would also learn more about the dark world, shrouded in mystery. What spells are needed for the ceremony? Luke embedded the ruby into the crown of the dagger, and he sensed a dark force that wrapped around it as if it were the key link to some kind of contract. Armanet tried to avert her fiery eyes and shook her head. "By piercing flesh and blood, the vessel will be connected to the god of death, Set, to complete the ritual." Luke thought about it for a while and stabbed himself in the chest with the dagger in front of everyone. Crack! The black crystal-like dagger bloomed with a few cracks. There was no defense at all. Luke was a little embarrassed. This dagger was only the medium for the ritual. In terms of sharpness, it was actually not much better than a fruit knife from the kitchen. "I'll try again." Luke's movements turned cautious. He was worried that if it failed again, the dagger might have to be destroyed. By stimulating the power left behind by the god of death, and by the way, minimizing his own physical defense. The dagger finally made a small slit, and the moment it touched his blood, the ruby embedded at the top burst with light. The surging cold dark energy, like a flood, broke through the dam and poured into Luke's flesh and blood. A dark shadow, seemingly coming through the door of the material world, forced its way into his body, emitting a hiss of excitement. The hieroglyphs branded on Armanet's face gradually emerged on Luke's face. A strong dark power, like a fountain, gushed out, lingering around his body. I have descended upon the earth. Luke swallowed back the catchphrase before he could shout it with the aura of a Chuanibiao. I'm sorry, the ownership of this body belongs to me. Superman shook his head and said so. And your authority over death is now mine. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. // Comment. 32 comments. Vote. Chapter 340, Chapter 337 Earth Casino, Underworld. Thousands of years ago, when Set attempted to enter this world with the ritual, turning ancient Egypt into an invincible empire of the dead, he certainly never thought that there were mortals who could resist him. Clearly, he had occupied the body, completing the reincarnation process. But when he came, even if this human was the one who willingly invited him in, now he was the one being caught. Arrogance. The dark shadow inside Luke's body tumbled. A dense flame formed a solid eruption, like a brightly burning fire. The dense hieroglyphs, like mantras, appeared on his face, looking particularly gruesome. Is this the wrath of death? Luke stood where he was, unmoved. There was neither panic nor the slightest fear. Right now, everything was still under his control. He used to think that the gods symbolizing power, war, desert, and death might be a little more powerful than they appeared. Considering the thousands of years and the changes of the times, there might only be a few people that knew about the great Ennead 9 deities in Egyptian mythology in their prime. It was understandable that their powers were weakened. That's all. After a rhetorical question, Luke gave his answer. The light-hearted comment was like merciless ridicule, completely provoking Set's thunderous anger. The dark shadow in his body took on the form of a jackal-headed man. I'll make you feel. Set had wanted to threaten and extract the life force of this arrogant human to make him understand the pain of death. But on second thought, if Luke died, the ritual would fail. He had been waiting for thousands of years, and his plan to come to this world was about to fail. In a dilemma, Set was at a loss, and his high-sounding voice suddenly fell silent. Feel what? The predicament of a lonely old god. A contemptuous sneer came from Luke's mouth. The great Ennead have become a thing of the past. In this age of decaying faith, you are no different from the antiques in the thrift store. Those things, at least, are worth something. But you're worthless. Each word was like a sharp blade, uncovering what was left of Set's facade and dignity. Lifting the seemingly mysterious and powerful veneer, revealing the strong outside and weak inside nature. I have dealt with many dimensional demon gods who support the world on their own and whose existence is constantly expanding, like twinkling stars standing in the sea of the universe, unshaken by the changes of external objects. And you, who have lost the power given by faith, are even worse than mortals. Luke mobilized the stellar energy in his body to suppress the powerless and raging god of death, Set. At the same time, he also used the identity of a sorcerer supreme to communicate with the Vishanti and extract some power. A magnificent column of pure white light descended from the sky and enveloped Superman. The ancient gods. Set was horrified. He was one of the great Ennead. Naturally, he could detect the true identity of the Vishanti. "You're too slow." Luke smiled. Pure white light filled his body. The fierce black shadow, like snow under the sun, continuously evaporated. "Your authority over death, I'll happily accept it." Luke opened his right hand, and a pharaoh's scepter gradually condensed and appeared in his palm. He suddenly grasped it. His eyes flashed with black rays, which was extremely shocking. The power of Set, one of the great Ennead, thus fell into his hands. "I curse you. With my life, with everything I have." The dark, shadowy figure was dragged, pulled, and slowly detached from Luke's body. However hard it struggled, however hard it rejected it, everything was useless. "Don't be like that. Your name, your image, will always exist in history." Luke laughed softly as he felt the power of the scepter. "I'm just a god of death by proxy, I have no followers, and I'm not worshipped in a temple. Think about it differently. I'm actually working for you. You're my boss." "Set, does that make you feel any better?" The Egyptian god of death, seemingly shocked by the shamelessness of mankind, fell into a long silence until the dark shadows left his body completely. Hiss hiss. Hiss hiss hiss. When Set was exposed to the sun, he instantly turned into a wisp of smoke. Thick black oil-like flames raised a large fire. The wailing and hissing of anguish disappeared along with the hideous form of the god of death, Set. "Death is gone." Dr. Henry, who had been watching, and all the members of Prodigium were stunned. Although they didn't understand what had happened just now, they were still shaken when the results were presented to them. An Egyptian god, who was worshipped by the world thousands of years ago, simply disappeared. Even if the vast majority of everyone here were firm atheists. But after witnessing this scene, not only were their perceptions shaken, but they also had a passionate feeling of awe and admiration for Superman. The constantly refreshing and rising reputation value was the most obvious. "The gods won't completely die." Luke corrected Dr. Henry's misconception. In his eyes, every life form had an illusory line of varying length. That's the length of life. He could try to cut off or renew someone's lifeline with the pharaoh's scepter held in his right hand whenever he wanted. Of course, it wasn't easy, and there was a price to pay. As long as their names were remembered, and as long as the traces in history aren't completely lost. Luke stared at Amenet, the Egyptian princess, who was trembling with fear and had almost her entire face covered with terror. "They will have the opportunity to be resurrected and come to this world. Maybe hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, Set, who has fallen into a new slumber, will appear again." D. Henry listened carefully. He couldn't help thinking, if Set went to sleep in the dark, then isn't Superman, holding the pharaoh's scepter, the same as a living god of death? With this in mind, the Prodigium senior executive subconsciously buried his head a little lower. This was fear toward a god. It's not as scary as you think it is. Luke seemed to have guessed what Dr. Henry was thinking and slightly shook his head. He didn't explain too much. Those complicated concepts were too complicated for ordinary people. The belief system of this world had long been divided among many gods and deities. Olympian gods, Greek gods, Norse gods, ancient India, ancient Egypt. In addition, the two camps of heaven and hell. The souls of those believers were labeled the moment they knelt and prayed to a particular deity. When they reach the end of their lives, they become a bargaining chip for their gods. Those dimensional demon gods, at best, only picked up some little leftover scraps of food. Relatively speaking, the chips weren't as important to them as the gods were. To Luke, the earth was like a huge casino. Those gods who rarely appeared in this world were bosses who hid behind the scenes. The competition was to see who had more chips and who had a stronger background. Lord Death. Armainet, who was silently trying to blend in the background, made a little noise. "What can I do for you?" According to the original contract, she would help Set, the god of death, descend into the human world. In return, not only would she live forever, she would become his partner and rule over a large territory. But what was happening right now was completely beyond her and Set's expectations. "The dead aren't welcomed in this world," Luke said lightly. Armainet trembled and fell to her knees. She had a hard time getting rid of the thousands of years of darkness, the seal of the sarcophagus. If she were to return to her original situation and suffer that kind of torture, it would be worse than death. "However, considering my underworld, I need someone to manage it." The corners of Luke's mouth curled up, evoking fear in the Egyptian princess, then he wiped it off with his own hands. "Are you ready to work for me, Armainet?" The ups and downs of life made this Egyptian princess feel like she was on a roller coaster ride. She breathed a long sigh of relief, and excited tears were almost falling from her eyes. "I will take good care of the underworld for you," Armainet assured. "I hope so." Luke held the pharaoh's scepter, and his eyes turned black. Rumble, rumble. A loud disembodied sound, like chains twisting and gears gnashing, sounded. A magnificent portal, branded with hieroglyphs, slowly opened. That was the underworld. The kingdom of the dead. At the moment when the underworld was opened up, Luke seemed to have a subtle connection with the kingdom of the dead that existed in a different place. His vision, through the barrier of space, saw a cold world full of humid fog. Then, a graceful figure in a green cloak came into view. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 25 comments. Vote. Chapter 341, Chapter 338 History of the Nine Realms, Gifted Student. Is that Hela? Luke recalled the slender figure he saw when he opened the underworld earlier and was a little uncertain. It was just a quick glance, and he didn't see too much. The slender figure in the green cloak finally seemed to look back. The fog, cold, it should be the underworld, hell. Luke pondered for a moment and got the answer. Asgard's god of death was Hela, Odin's eldest daughter. The other party was imprisoned in hell, waiting for Ragnarok. Almost all of the crises in Asgard could be summarized as family disputes. It was nothing more than the younger brother being jealous of the older brother, father preferring older brother, sister despising her younger brothers, and so on and so forth. The gods of death of different divine lineages have similar authority and therefore have a subtle connection. Luke put away his thoughts and stopped thinking about them. If he had an opportunity in the future, he should go to Asgard. Compared to Loki and Thor, he felt that there was more room for cooperation between himself and Hela. They were both gods of death. They should get along, more or less. I'm the Sorcerer Supreme. I won't lose my confidence in front of Odin. Luke believed that in terms of strength, he was already qualified to compete with the king of the gods and wouldn't be treated as an insignificant mortal by Asgard. As a representative of Earth and the Sorcerer Supreme, his status wasn't much worse than Odin. The Asgardians are notoriously bad at communicating in the Nine Realms. Luke thought of the information he had read in the Comitage's library, that the guys who lived in the palace weren't very hospitable. Not to mention Thor's foolish appearance, he had the wrong perception of Asgard. People there were thought to be kind and passionate by nature. As people know, when Asgard's warriors Three and Sif came to Earth in search of Thor, they directly commented that Midgard was a poor backwater place. They treated people on Earth in the same way that noble lords treated commoners. Proud, condescending, and commanding. Besides, Asgard itself was built on warfare and brutality. The Aesir and the Vanir were incompatible and hated each other a long time ago. Asgard didn't come into being until peace was reached and hostilities were resolved. Later, Asgard, which was unified internally, had the ambition to compete for the throne of the Nine Realms. They challenged the ruler of the time, the most powerful race of the Nine Realms, the Dark Elves. Despite standing in the upper reaches of history, from the perspective of the latter, this was a battle for justice, a great victory, which prevented the Nine Realms from sinking into darkness. But Odin's father, the former king of the gods who led Asgard to glory, was motivated by the idea of vying for the throne of power in the Nine Realms. Later, the frost giants of Jotunheim challenged Asgard, but it was just a historical replay of the struggle for power. The challenger was replaced by someone else. In short, Asgard was a warrior race that revered force, expanded its territory through war, and eventually ruled the Nine Realms. It would be overly naive to have any wonderful fantasies about them. Luke himself didn't rule out the possibility of a future conflict with Asgard. According to his character, running into that kind of condescending, despising asshole would always stir up more trouble. This is the end of the discussion about mummies and the Egyptian gods of death. The pharaoh's scepter that Luke was holding slowly disappeared as he threw Armanet into the underworld to work for free. The dense black light in his eyes, which was frightening, also quietly dissipated. Dr. Henry, who wasn't breathing well, finally breathed a sigh of relief and no longer felt the pressure. I have a somewhat premature suggestion about prodigium. Thinking back to the outside world, Luke spoke in a negotiating tone. SHIELD has a similar division and will contact and cooperate with the Magic Congress in the future. If Dr. Jekyll and the people behind you have no objections, they can consider joining them. The smile on Dr. Henry's face was a little stiff. It sounded like a negotiation, but after careful consideration, Prodigium didn't have the qualifications to refuse. Don't think too much. It's just a suggestion and a friendly inquiry. Luke patted the other on the shoulder and comforted. He was slightly interested in the information about the monsters and mysterious collections stored in Prodigium. If nothing else, the two secret books from the mummy world, the Black Book of the Dead and the Golden Book of Amun-Ra, were of great use. As the newly appointed god of death, Luke was trying to perfect his underworld. However, the friendly attitude only had the opposite effect. Dr. Henry thought that Superman could even handle the Egyptian god of death, Set, and so Prodigium, like the mummy princess Armanet, was more docile than Dr. Henry's pet, in front of Luke. He couldn't help but panic even more. General, sir, you misunderstood. Dr. Henry, who had the authority to make the decision, cleared his throat a few minutes later and said, I was just thinking about moving the headquarters from London to New York or Washington, D.C. In this way, we can get closer to you, General. To bask under the light of justice, the beacon of light of humanity. Hiss. Luke paused, a little shocked. He didn't expect such a wide-eyed, decent-looking guy as Dr. Henry would be able to say such a flattering thing without any sense of decency. You don't have to, Dr. Jekyll," Luke said with a straight face. "I don't like to force people." Dr. Henry shook his head again and again. He was determined to send Prodigium off to SHIELD with a firm attitude. After the back and forth between the two sides and the desire to push and pull, a consensus was finally reached. "I say, Dr. Jekyll, you're French." Luke looked at the other side's eager look and asked curiously. According to the usual process, shouldn't Luke be the one to pressure him a few times and entice and force Dr. Henry to get him to agree to it? Why did Prodigium fall on their own accord before he even started? "I was born in England, and I'm Scottish." Dr. Henry didn't understand his meaning and replied seriously. "Since Dr. Jekyll agrees, Prodigium will be a sub-agency of SHIELD in the future." Luke frowned slightly, as if remembering something, and added, "By the way, S.H.I.E.L.D is an international organization recognized by the World Security Council and doesn't belong to any country. Our goal is to strive for the common good and destiny of mankind." Dr. Henry was puzzled at first, but after careful consideration, he understood. Was this implying that the resources and energy of Prodigium only belonged to S.H.I.E.L.D and would have nothing to do with the federal government? Dr. Henry's eyes sparkled. An individual who was strong on his own and didn't need to rely on others for support wouldn't like restrictions. With Superman's strength, there was absolutely no need to obey the White House. On the contrary, the president should worry about whether a Superman political government might emerge someday, leaving him and Congress in limbo. Therefore, it seemed reasonable for Superman to focus on himself and ignore the existence of the White House. The general has a broad mind and is tolerant of the world. Dr. Henry flattered and patted him on the back. Luke smiled and ignored it. The upright figure rose from the ground and shot into the sky. Half a month later, Luke got up from the gentle valley. Looking at the bedroom where the battle marks were left, the clothes flying everywhere, from the doorway to the bed, proved how intense the situation was. "We can't keep enjoying things like this." Luke reflected on himself. He could only occasionally stop and pause on the road forward, but he could never stop moving forward. After he finished dealing with the Egyptian mummies and the Prodigium part of the incident, before long, he appeared in the White House and attended a secret meeting. The contents were strictly confidential and must not be spread to the outside world. After all, the president was brainwashed, and the government almost became a personal tool for some people. It was feared that such a story would provoke a strong public outcry and stir up public distrust of the federal government. Although, many years from now, there was a president who accomplished the amazing feat of returning to Earth from the moon, and did just that. As for Kang the Conqueror and Mr. Sinister, they both passively became the top leaders of Hydra. Compared with a man from the future, mutants had more of an identity. Luke found Hydra more compelling and easier for the people to understand. Anyway, those guys had always been very professional in taking the blame. No one questioned the truth that Luke told. On the one hand, he had enough evidence. On the other hand, truthfulness wasn't important. After this incident, the president was bound to be partially responsible. Either leave the White House with dignity or be impeached and get attacked. This was actually a good thing for many people. For example, other parties or politicians who were interested in the general election. In Luke's opinion, these were just boring games, and he wasn't interested in paying attention to them. Regardless of who the president represented in office, their attitude toward SHIELD and Superman wouldn't change much. The real work that was keeping Luke busy was the completion of the Mutant Academy. As an honorary board member, he had just learned that the school had welcomed a talented student with incredible potential. His name was Charles Francis Xavier. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 32 comments. Vote. Chapter 342, Chapter 339 Unfortunate Childhood, School for the Gifted. Luke pushed for the establishment of the Mutant Academy, and finally finalized the plan, and passed the congressional bill. It was different from the private school of the bald professor of the future. It was a no certification needed, no qualification needed, no federal approval needed educational institution that couldn't be banned at any time and fined severely. This institution belonged to SHIELD. It had a strong faculty, a wide range of certifications, a beautiful principal, and an honorary trustee Superman. If they really opened enrollment to anyone, the threshold would be flattened by the number of people coming in. If it weren't for the fact that the school only accepted mutants, the rich and famous upper-class elite would probably send their own children to the school. After graduating, no matter in business or politics, they would be regarded as students taught by Superman. What? Are you saying Superman wouldn't attend classes at all and was only an honorary trustee? It didn't matter, as long as there was a connection with him. It was like those many people who went to prestigious schools for the golden plaque. It's not about studying well and improving every day. Interpersonal communication, as well as sparkling personal resumes, was their real purpose. And being from a prestigious school, or going to the same school as a celebrity, would always make other people show a bit more respect. In American politics, there were already the Harvard clique and Yale clique. The Supreme Court had 9 top justices, all of whom came from Harvard and Yale law schools. Many people say that you don't need to be a graduate of a prestigious school to be president, but if you want to be a Supreme Justice, you have to be from Columbia and Northwestern, not Harvard or Yale. Anyway, Superman set out to set up a mutant academy, which attracted a lot of attention. In that case, young Charles should be the best in his class. Luke leaned back in the limo's back seat and closed the file that the White Queen had compiled and delivered. They are on their way to Manhattan's Long Island, where the recently built Mutant Academy was located. The original address was a private winery. Later, due to poor management, it went bankrupt. SHIELD acquired it at a very low price and transformed it into an all-in-one modern campus. The Mutant Academy was close to Howard Stark's estate and was considered a neighbor. In the future, if he had nothing to do, he could still visit next door. Mental ability has always been rare. The fact that Charles was able to awaken his talent and master his abilities at such a young age, he's indeed a rare genius. The White Queen lifted her hair behind her ears and whispered. Most of the natural abilities of mutants are awakened in adolescence. Intense emotions and rapid growth could easily activate the X gene in their body. If someone could awaken their abilities at a young age, their strength wouldn't be too bad. Just a few people, Professor X, Magneto, the Phoenix Jean Grey, Mr. Fantastic's son Franklin. They're all powerhouses. The worst was an alpha-level powerhouse. By the way, he has a younger sister, called Raven, who's also a mutant. The White Queen seemed to remember something and added. She can change her own cellular and tissue structure. Simply put, she can morph and take on the appearance of anyone, even subtle things like irises and fingerprints. Luke raised an eyebrow. The future Professor X and Mystique had become his students. The few leaders of the mutants, only Magneto, hadn't appeared. Speaking of, he always thought that Professor X was someone with a protagonist role, inherited his parents' wealth at a young age, and adopted a sister who wasn't related by blood. Both parents died, he got the car and the house, he had a beautiful sister and a best friend who shared affection and dislike for each other. He's more of a protagonist than I am. I read that young Charles was born into a wealthy family in New York, and his father Brian Xavier was a scientist, who later joined the business community and became rich. Luke put his mind at ease and asked, how could he accept that his son is a mutant, or, to put it another way, how could he accept that his son is enrolled in a school for mutants? Such an approach, to use an inappropriate analogy, was tantamount to an elite sending their son to a school in the slums. There was no doubt that they would bear some strange looks and criticism. Although on the legislative front, Luke had already started to secretly push for the passage and implementation of a Mutant Registration Act and was ready to change the public perception. This wasn't something that could be changed and achieved overnight. It took time to accept. I made a visit and met Charles's parents. White Queen was studying hard on how to be a qualified principal. Since she ran away from home, she hadn't had a proper occupation or career. After joining the Hellfire Club, he shouted slogans with Sebastian Shaw every day to brainwash their compatriots. It didn't give people a sense of satisfaction and self-identity at all. The White Queen was grateful to Luke for leaving the management of the Mutant Academy to her. That night, when she sat there and shook her waist, her movements were much more vigorous. Charles's parents were more open-minded and accepted their son's mutant status very early. White Queen shook off the embarrassing picture in her mind and went on to say, that child is much more mature and quiet than his peers. He has his own ideas and is very smart. The decision to adopt Raven was also a decision his parents made after he convinced them. He personally believes that a mutant academy is more appropriate than an ordinary private high school or an elite school. Luke nodded his head. A psychic like Charles could listen to their hearts and read their thoughts. It was too easy for him to guide the behavior of others. What's more, he had been behaving like the perfect child, studying hard and listening quietly. Every governess in charge of teaching young Charles had expressed the same sentiment. This was a true prodigy, a genius. With very different family backgrounds and childhood experiences, it's no wonder that those two people would take opposite paths in the future. Luke remembered the personal file he had just read and let out a chuckle. Born into a wealthy family in New York, young Charles was a lucky kid who grew up with a silver spoon. Living in the castle-like mansion in Westchester, he had servants to take care of his daily life. And his future best friend and partner, Magneto Eric Leonshare. However, because of his Jewish identity, his family was persecuted, he was placed in a concentration camp and felt the cruelty of war. There was a saying, unfortunate people spend their lives curing their childhood, and lucky people spend their lives being cured by their childhood. The two leaders of the mutants, Professor X and Magneto, couldn't be more appropriate for this. Magneto, who saw his mother die in front of him, saw and experienced all the terrible things on Earth, such as racial persecution and slaughter. Naturally, it was hard for him to understand Charles's pacifism and conservatism, and thus he thought such behavior to be cowardice and weakness. However, Charles, who had a happy family and a happy life, could only sympathize with Magneto's miserable childhood but couldn't feel it. Such a concept led to the division of the mutants and the confrontation between the two camps. How many students have you accepted this year? Luke talked about the main business. He started to build an academy. In addition to wanting to give mutants a place to live, he was also taking into account the rapid changes in the future. Superheroes, alien races, evil organizations, cosmic crisis. These were the eternal themes in the Marvel Universe. Therefore, there was no harm in taking the lead and setting things up first. The total number of eligible candidates is 31. White Queen smiled a little helplessly. On the one hand, many families still held conservative ideas about mutants. On the other hand, about 30% of the mutants had significant genetic defects. Either their appearance was much too different from ordinary people, or their ability was uncontrollable. They were not eligible for enrollment and were referred to medical institutions at most. Not bad. There will be more and more in the future. Luke was very satisfied. In his opinion, this wave of enrollment attracted future Professor X and Mystique to the door. It was quite successful. It was equivalent to drawing 10 times in a row and acquiring 2 legendary golden cards. Here we are. 2 iron doors opened up, and the limo slowly entered a vast private estate. On the nameplate at the door were the words Cavill's School for Gifted Youngsters. That's the official name of the school. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. // Comment. 26 comments. Vote. Chapter 343, Chapter 340. The Principal, Annoying Sister. When the car entered the academy, the first thing people saw was a huge bronze statue. The cloak looked as if it was billowing, waving in an arc. The head was raised, showing a determined look. It was as if the light of righteousness shone on his body. With pure copper casting, the muscle lines were outlined, which fully interpreted the strong sense of strength. It was Superman. Did you have to get this thing? Luke walked out of the car and found his statue standing in the most conspicuous place in the academy, feeling a little awkward. Frankly speaking, I'm not a big fan of creating a cult. He had always firmly believed that if it weren't for reputation points, he would be a modest man with a low profile and no vanity. Becoming an idol was Captain America's business. The White Queen smiled and explained, I specially asked someone to build this bronze statue. You are the symbol of the Academy and the guarantee for mutants. She knew very well that the public was gradually recognizing them, and they didn't win this treatment by themselves. It was Luke who pushed it behind the scenes, which led to the current situation. Superman, S.H.I.E.L.D. The influence of these 2 mountains was increasing. No matter who wanted to climb the pyramid of power, it was impossible to ignore their existence. The White House was busy with the next general election, waiting for a new owner. Eisenhower and Kennedy Jr. were actively courting Superman. In addition to the Army and Navy departments, the Pentagon gradually came up with a saying of the Superman department. Most of its members came from various intelligence departments. After all, the number of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents had been expanding. The CIA and the FBI were almost dried up. Only this time, although Hoover felt aggrieved and bitter, he was afraid to say anything about it. This time, it was different from the past, and provoking Superman was tantamount to looking for death right now. Well, take me to meet your talented students. Luke nodded, acknowledging the existence of the bronze Superman statue. It's better to put it here than to put it in a museum. He didn't want to be dragged away by the Ministry of Defense in the future to do ideological education for young people. Captain America's patriotic education video was simply a public execution. The foundation of a great school is not only the teachers and the faculty, but also the reputation that makes the students feel proud and full of pride. Superman is undoubtedly the most suitable candidate. The White Queen smiled triumphantly and walked ahead to lead the way. Although Luke wasn't a mutant, he showed a sufficiently friendly attitude. He could be a symbol of the Academy for the Gifted. The people in Congress didn't deceive me. The architectural layout and design are good. Luke strolled along the shore of the lake towards the school building that stood behind the dense forest. This mutant academy in Long Island was more secluded than the mansions and castles of Westchester. In addition to the long white buildings, there were large lawns, forests, and beaches surrounding the area, which were beautiful and relaxing. There was a private harbor attached to the west, where one could sail out to sea at any time. In the dormitory, resting area. Raven, when you see Miss Frost, you should show some respect. Charles, who was dressed like a young adult with a bow tie and a suit, gave special instructions. Standing in front of him was a little girl with red hair. The round face is dotted with a few freckles. The yellow pupils kept turning, appearing to be very spiritual. I know, Charles. You're so long-winded, just like Mr. Bryan, always repeating things I already remember. The young mystique, Raven, spoke with impatience. Her attention was focused on the TV screen. She didn't take Charles's words to heart at all. Miss Frost was not a bad person, and she wouldn't hurt her. Raven didn't understand why Charles was so nervous. She's a telepath, and she has similar powers to me. Charles whispered. That's why during the last home visit, you were secretly thinking, Ms. Frost looks like a bad woman. She should have heard that. Raven was startled and took 2 steps backward, falling onto the couch with a loud plop. The face, dotted with a few small freckles, was full of panic. You're not lying to me, are you, Charles? I didn't mean to. Raven cried. Teachers and doctors were the 2 people she was most afraid of at the moment. Miss Frost, she's not going to punish me, is she? She's not going to make me write essays or take points off my test, right? Compared to Charles, who was known as a child prodigy, Raven's academic performance was quite average. In her opinion, exams were hell. If you could behave, maybe Miss Frost wouldn't punish you. Seeing that his naughty sister was frightened, Charles didn't say much. In fact, this spoiled child was quite a headache. There were all kinds of strange ideas in Raven's head and bizarre questions that even Charles couldn't answer sometimes. For example, Charles, can you sing Star-Spangled Man with a Plan? Charles, do you know why Aunt Rose is sleeping with Uncle Pierre even though she's married to Uncle Johnny? For his sister Raven, who pestered him, Charles occasionally wondered if he made the right choice in taking in this girl who had 10,000 questions. Remember. Act like a little lady, Raven. After repeating the instructions, Charles fixed his clothes and led his sister to the principal's office. Miss Frost said that an important guest was going to come today. Compared with Captain America, who was popular in the surrounding area and popular in comics, Superman is the mature young Charles' real idol. Precocious children often preferred to be different from others. Peers of the same age love the exaggerated pecs, the star-spangled shield, and America's ass. Charles, however, worshipped Superman's image, strength, and power. He thought that this was the perfect human form. "Hello, young Charles." Luke, sitting in the principal's office, saw the young Professor X knocking on the door, followed by the reserved young girl, Raven. He didn't regard the others as children, taking candy out of his pocket, or making childish jokes. Even though Charles was very young, he was far more mature in thinking than his peers. Treating people as equals made it easier to earn goodwill and trust. "Hello, Mr. Principal," Charles said with a solemn expression. "Seeing you is the most exciting thing I've ever done other than convincing my parents to enroll in school." Although Luke was only an honorary trustee, Charles still chose to address him as principal. "Miss Frost and I are delighted to have recruited such an outstanding student as yourself." Luke smiled, not showing the slightest sign of disgust at Charles' overly formal tone. "Ms. Frost?" A question popped up in Charles's clever little brain. "Where did White Queen go? She's the principal, right? Shouldn't she be here?" Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. // Comment. 27 comments. Vote. Chapter 344, Chapter 341 Role-playing, Implicit Words. After about 20 minutes of meeting and chatting, Luke had a deeper understanding of the young Charles in front of him. His conversation and manners were all trying to imitate adults. With a serious tone, meticulous hair, bow tie, and suit. It reminded Luke of young Sheldon, an annoying person with severe cleanliness and an equally intelligent mind. Young Charles' image highly overlapped with the other. "Mr. Principal, the main reason why I want to be a member of this academy is that I need to find peers and my respect for you." When Luke asked about the reasons for enrolling in school, Charles seemed to have written a draft before and seriously replied, "I found myself different when I was 8 years old. One night, I was a little scared because of the movie I saw at night, Zorro. The dark shadows, like bat-like monsters, scared me." Luke's mouth twitched. This story seems familiar. In the universe next door where the painting style was kept dark, every time the movie Zorro was mentioned, there would be a dark alley, a gunman, a string of fallen pearls, and an orphan who lost his parents. This classic scene would be repeated several times every once in a while. If Erskine influenced Steve Rogers' life, and that cave in the Middle East changed Tony Stark, that alley in Gotham was probably Batman's lifelong nightmare. I tossed and turned and couldn't sleep, so I pushed the door of my bedroom and stood in the hallway. Then I heard my parents arguing. It was amazing how I could hear their conversation so clearly through a wall and a thick door. It's not just the conversation. It's also the words they kept bottled up and didn't voice out. I was like a radio that was out of control, receiving all the information from the outside world. All those confusing sounds, dark and scary thoughts, filled my head. After that, I had a very high fever for 2 days. Charles's little face showed that he was having some flashbacks. His natural ability, awakening quietly, appeared. "You haven't told anyone else?" Luke crossed his arms and held his chin up. The tone of his voice was normal, but sometimes he would unconsciously sigh as if he was holding back something. Charles, who had a keen observation ability, discovered this. But he didn't take it to heart and continued, "No, Mr. Principal. This is my secret. I was afraid to say anything to anyone for fear of being admitted to a hospital or being subjected to some terrible treatment. Charles's eyes couldn't help but show a touch of fear. Although he was much more mature than his peers, after all, he was only a child. In the face of unexpected surprises and an unpredictable future, he would still be frightened. So, he chose to hide it. "You did the right thing, Charles." Luke nodded and agreed. With both hands covering his face, it slightly twitched for a few moments. His expressions also became odd, as if they were suffering from some kind of stimulation. He underestimated the White Queen, and the other party's flexible tongue, which could tie cherry stems into knots, was beyond the reach of ordinary people. His joystick was like the pottery touched by the heroine in the movie Ghost. The slippery feel, high-speed friction, spinning. If Luke didn't have great perseverance, he wouldn't be able to endure such extreme torture. "I once thought that I was the only one in the world who was so different and could listen to the voices of others and read their thoughts." Charles spoke a little emotionally, without taking into account that there was something wrong with the principal, and turned to look at his sister, who was in a daze and wandering off in her own mind. "Fortunately, when I met Raven, I realized that I wasn't unique, and I also had compatriots similar to me. Since then, I have paid special attention to the news about mutants. Until I heard your speech, Mr. Principal. I was deeply moved by your interpretation of freedom, equality, and human rights." Charles's little face was full of sincerity, his eyes shining with glittering light, an emotion called admiration. "So, you were brave enough to confess your mutant identity to your parents and become the first student in this academy. You're a good kid, Charles." Luke was silent for a few seconds, leaned forward, and smiled. "You're very talented and have outstanding abilities. You will have a bright future. However, before you can tap into your potential, you must first look at yourself and accept yourself. Charles, you don't have to be nervous about your identity for fear of being looked at differently by others. The mutant gift is not some terrible curse or a painful disease, at least not for you. It is a way to get rid of the ordinary and fly up to the sky. It is the key to open the door of evolution, allowing you to see the world from a different perspective." Luke's mouth started his signature pep talk, fully immersed in his role as a life coach. "But, Mr. Principal, human beings are afraid of the unknown." Charles hesitated. He had been hiding his natural ability for fear of being discovered by others. If we come to the forefront and appear in the public eye, will it cause them to be wary and disgusted, leading to violent conflicts? It must be said that Charles was indeed a precocious child. At his age, he was able to think about racial disputes and existential conflicts through the two camps of humans and mutants, which were already beyond his peers. The conservative, moderate nature is now evident. Luke smiled faintly and leaned forward, then slightly leaned back. The tense face also relaxed a little. Hiding one's ability to ensure harmony with humans and avoid violent conflicts. These were the guiding ideologies from Professor X. But he didn't fully agree. "You can't only see the downside of everything, Charles. We need to learn to look at the issues in a constructive way. Living space and ethnic disputes, these are all internal conflicts. If we want to resolve the problem, we have to shift our attention to external conflicts. Maybe in a few decades, our footprints won't be limited to the land, sea, and sky." Luke said meaningfully. Every time something big happened, the minimum level was a cosmic level crisis. The Earth was a special planet, it was the origin of the ancient gods, and it was also secretly coveted by dimensional demons. Every cosmic upheaval inevitably started with it or would eventually affect it. Luke wasn't a passive person, and he liked to take the initiative. Sooner or later, human beings would have to go out, then the problems of living space and racial disputes would gradually disappear and become a footnote in history. At that time, the countries and people on this planet would need to face the three galactic empires, the elders of the universe, Thanos. They would soon understand their own insignificance and would know that internal conflict was meaningless. I see, Mr. Principal. Charles seemed to have realized something and seriously nodded his head. All internal contradictions could be diverted through external conflicts. Compared with hostile alien races, mutants were insignificant. But where were the aliens? The future will give you the answer. Facing Charles's doubts, Luke mysteriously smiled. But then, his smile froze. Like a pumping machine, the strong suction force simply wrapped up one's soul. If there's nothing else, you can go out now. Luke could articulate clearly and enunciate slowly. Charles left the office with his sister. Before he closed the door, he looked at the principal, who had his hands on the wide desk. Raven, did you see? The principal seems like he was in pain. Looking back on the conversation, Charles felt that Superman was suppressing something. He was a telepath and had a very keen intuition in this respect. I'm hungry, Charles. Raven said while covering her stomach and a naive expression. She didn't pay attention to the details at all. She just wanted to have an early snack. Maybe I was wrong. Charles took his sister's hand and walked to the cafeteria. And in the principal's office, the White Queen, who wasn't there, wiped the corner of her mouth and glanced at Luke with mild amusement. Is this your first time? In her question, there was a certain kind of competitive sentiment. I tried it once with Melina, but it was in an upscale restaurant. Luke, answer honestly. Humph. Then we'll go to an upscale restaurant next time. The White Queen held her head high. Although there was no thought of jealousy, she had a strong sense of ambition in this regard. Do you know that this will only benefit me? Luke loosened his tie. He wanted to have a serious meeting when he came. However, the White Queen became a principal for the first time, and she was excited about her career, so it was a little hard to calm her down. I can also give more benefits to you. What do you think about the female student who had to submit to the principal for the sake of her exam results? The White Queen spun around and tousled her blonde hair, making herself look more like a poor schoolgirl instead of a powerful principal. Or, the arrogant and impolite female principal and the strong and powerful security guard. Luke cleared his throat, picked up the cup on the table, and took a sip of water. Although he was unwilling to admit it, he was a bit interested. Role-playing was a game that everyone liked. Men and women alike. Isn't it a little early for that? Luke acted like a decent person, barely keeping up his decent image. The White Queen, however, pressed on. She enjoyed seeing Superman lose his cool. Principal Cavill, if you can give me an A in the final exam, I'll do anything. This blonde beauty blinked her eyes and put her hands behind her back with an innocent look on her face. Hiss. The game moved too fast. Luke lamented. He decided to cooperate with the others' performance. It's not because he couldn't hold back and give in to temptation. He just wanted to play a role-playing game and do a good job as a principal. Luke believed that he only had a superficial and shallow understanding of this profession. He needed to dig deeper and more thoroughly into its significance. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 33 comments. Vote. Chapter 345, Chapter 342 Four Horsemen, Magneto. Pleasant times would always pass by quickly. By the time Luke was dressed, and the wet stains on his desk had evaporated, it was several hours later. A large cloud came over, blocking out the blazing sun. Frankly, Emma, you deserve an A and for your excellent performance and hands-on experience in this course. Luke leaned against the comfortable leather chair and praised her. You're an outstanding student, not only with rich theoretical knowledge but also excellent practical skills. The White Queen smiled and tied on the tie for the principal in a well-behaved manner. Then, after sorting out her messy clothes, she got down to business. Looking at the rosy-cheeked, refreshed White Queen, Luke couldn't help but feel a little impressed. Obviously, it was such an exhausting and emotionally intense high-intensity exercise, but the other party wasn't tired at all. This also confirmed that the relationship between a man and a woman was like that between a cow and a field. No matter how hard the cow plowed, the field would only grow fertile and productive. Superman, of course, had no trouble in this regard. He was a pile-driving machine that never got tired, plowing deep into the land and sowing hard. You need to find teachers who are much more patient and better suited to education. The White Queen sat on the edge of the desk, leaning sideways. Her hands pushed her sweat-stained blonde hair back from her cheeks. Women are always concerned about their appearance. The White Queen, who had spent her makeup, touched up her foundation and said, "Our students are still children and not only need an outstanding educational environment, they also need excellent teachers. Are you implying that a certain couple of brothers are not qualified?" Luke picked his eyebrows. The teachers of the Mutant Academy must be mutants. This would allow the Academy to maintain its independent operation and prevent infiltration by other forces. It would also create a sense of belonging for those students as if they had come to a big family belonging to their compatriots. There would be no estrangement from the outside world. Charles would rather confess his mutant status to his parents and sign up for the Academy for the Gifted, mainly because he wanted to find more compatriots. The only problem was that not just anyone could handle the job of a teacher. The Academy currently offered several courses, including mandatory courses in national languages, national history, social sciences, and natural sciences. There were elective courses in the arts, such as music and drama. When students would move on to higher grades, there would be more rigorous combat classes. Overall, the pressure to study wasn't too much. However, the vast majority of mutant groups awakened their abilities during puberty. Once their identity was exposed, they would be rejected and treated unkindly by the outside world. This contributed to the fact that most of the mutants couldn't pass through the adolescent stage normally. For example, the White Queen herself was an obvious example. She ran away from home without finishing college and became a social outcast. If it weren't for her excellent family background, ability, and knowledge, she wouldn't have been appointed by Luke as the principal. Brothers like Sabretooth and Wolverine had been wandering all year round and hadn't received any systematic education. Apart from motherfucker, it was shit and bitch, they could be classified as illiterate. It was natural for them to have a lot of shortcomings as teachers. That's right. The White Queen's expression turned cold and seemed dissatisfied. Victor is a pay teacher, yet he only takes his students to watch the Chicago Bears and New York Giants football games. Last week, I even saw him drinking in front of the students at school. Logan is even worse. As a history teacher, he not only swears in class but also smokes cigars, making the classroom a terrible mess. The White Queen felt indignant and wanted to directly expel these two black sheep who had infiltrated the teaching staff. Make do with it for the time being. Luke shrugged his shoulders. He transferred Sabretooth and Wolverine, the pair of brothers, to become teachers, which was also an expedient measure. And, your sister, Kayla. She's doing very well, and she's also very popular with the students. The White Queen's face softened when she heard her sister's name. In fact, she also has her own personal feelings. The White Queen had never liked Logan, who stole her sister. She also hated Sabretooth just because he was Logan's brother. When the academy is on track, we will find a more suitable group of teachers. Luke, as an honorary school trustee, was still very concerned about the development of the academy for the gifted. There were quite a few mutants who wanted to live a quiet life, and they could be recruited as teachers at that time. The two of them discussed for a while and then went for tea. Luke met Charles and Raven in the cafeteria, in addition to some other students. Most of them were 13 to 15 years old, some were showing signs of abilities, and some had already awakened. However, talented child prodigies with outstanding abilities in the alpha level like Charles were ultimately a minority. They are the future. Luke said contentedly. If this mutant academy could gradually grow stronger and enter the public eye, in a few years, it would become the base camp of the mutant group in North America. They would flock over to seek a stable life, just like the gold diggers in the Great Western Gold Rush. The future is theirs as well as ours. The White Queen seemed to embody the feeling Sebastian Shaw had, the feeling of holding power and being believed in. In a sense, she was a great leader of the mutant camp. Charles is in the bag, so where is Magneto? Luke's mind wandered, looking through the windows, across the green lawns and hills, into the great distances. After the end of World War II, Germany was divided among the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union according to the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. The four countries formed the Allied Control Council, which took over the supreme power of the country. Before long, the Federal Republic of Germany would be established in the Western Occupation Zone, and the Democratic Republic of Germany would be established in the Soviet Occupation Zone in the East, also known as West Germany and East Germany. In a few years, the famous Berlin Wall was built. Germany, which had provoked the First and Second World Wars, officially split into two sovereign states. Caliban, the man you're talking about, is in Berlin. A tall figure covered in a long hood looked up at the devastated Berlin. The city was ravaged by Allied bombers back and forth, like the surface of the moon, full of potholes and gullies. War was a cruel game in which the loser got nothing, and the winner took everything. According to the resolution made at the Yalta Conference, Germany had to pay $20 billion in compensation during this time. Of these, $10 billion was given to the Soviet Union, $8 billion to the United States, and the remaining $2 billion to other countries. It wasn't until 2014, half a century later, that the German government paid off this huge foreign debt. That's right, Lord Apocalypse. Caliban followed behind. His perception was expanding, enveloping almost every corner of Berlin. As long as they were mutants, it was impossible to avoid his search. After the end of World War II, a mutant organization called the Hellfire Club surfaced. Their leader was Sebastian Shaw, an alpha mutant. I once took the commission from him to find suitable compatriots for him. Among the names Shaw provided, there was a child named Eric Leonshare, an important commodity he identified by name. Apocalypse listened and stepped forward. The streets of Berlin, to be exact, the empty spaces cleared of debris were barely visible, like an empty city. In World War II, Germany lost nearly 7 million adult males and almost exhausted its labor force. A large number of captured German soldiers were sent to Siberia to work as coolies and died there. That was to say, most of those who survived and stayed in Berlin were women and the elderly. Did you find him? Feeling the aura of war left behind in this land, Apocalypse's eyes flashed. In his view, human beings were despicable, backward, and arrogant low-level creatures. They were greedy, so they plundered. They were arrogant, so they were closed-minded. They were short-sighted, so they were stupid. So they needed a great leader, a great deity, a great master. That was him, Apocalypse. Found him. That kid, he's in the neighborhood, Caliban said as he bowed down. These days, he had fully seen Apocalypse's strength. It was easy for him to upgrade mutants and make up for the existing genetic defects. And, what's even more frightening, Apocalypse mastered countless innate abilities, such as teleportation, energy projection, and so on, which could be used with every gesture, completely breaking the limits of the mutant level. I wonder if that child will be destined to be a Four Horsemen member. Apocalypse held Caliban's shoulder and read his thoughts to learn the precise location. A passage then opened up and wrapped the two people into it. In almost a blink of an eye, they crossed the distance of the city and appeared in front of a dirty child wearing a pageboy cap. Eric Leonshare. Apocalypse looked at the other party. The child's face was reflected in his eyes. Eric, holding a bag of bread, was full of vigilance. Thinking these two guys were trying to rob him, and he subconsciously used his powers. The trash can in the alley, the reinforced concrete bars, and all the metal objects flew towards Apocalypse. Don't be nervous. I'm here to help you, Eric. Apocalypse said in a deep voice. With just a thought, those oncoming miscellaneous objects were uniformly broken into particles. Magnetic force. You have so much more potential than that, Eric. Apocalypse's eyes glowed as if he had seen a gold mine that hadn't been mined yet. He stepped forward and mentally invaded his opponent's mind, reading the memories that were buried deep in his heart. Eric's face showed pain. The bag of bread in his arms fell to the ground, and he slowly knelt down with his hands on his head. Hatred, hatred, hatred. Yes, that's right. Ignite the world with anger. Apocalypse stimulated the other party's memory and aroused the anger hidden at the bottom of his heart. He found the first Four Horsemen. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 23 comments. Vote. Chapter 346, Chapter 343 Going to Moscow, The Danger of Hydra. A few days later, Luke, who was staying in Shield, received the information from Berlin, Germany. Apocalypse appeared. The young director rubbed his chin and considered how to solve this unstable factor. Although Apocalypse was the god of mutants, proficient in various abilities and tenacious vitality, even the Phoenix Force couldn't completely kill him. However, Luke had the 10th metal. If he really wanted to get rid of Apocalypse, he wasn't without a solution. I've always been a man of peace. It's too rude to fight and kill at every turn. Luke leaned back in his seat and thought so. According to his understanding of Apocalypse, the former pharaoh woke up and figured out the world's current situation. He would inevitably start looking for the four horsemen, meaning, looking for four potential mutants, strengthening their talent and ability, and turning them into his four main fighters. To conquer the world and establish an empire on his behalf. After all, he was the great pharaoh, the great deity. If he did everything by himself, it wouldn't look good. Germany, Berlin. Luke curled his lips at the thought that Magneto was a Jewish German. Apocalypse's goal was probably one of the leaders of future mutants, Eric Lehnsherr. Not even letting a child go. This should be child abduction. Luke spat. Young Magneto, even without the help of Apocalypse, was already at an alpha level. It was far from the level of strength that could manipulate the magnetic field in the center of the Earth and tear the planet apart. Even if he took Magneto under his wing, there was no use. Wait and see, letting Apocalypse take the initiative to jump out could be a good thing. When the time comes, it could increase reputation. Luke shrugged off the complicated thoughts and closed the report. If the world was compared to a huge stage, Superman would be one of the brightest and most dazzling presences. Any hero would always need some vicious and ruthless villains to set off their own greatness, bringing light and justice to the world. For example, America often presented itself as a beacon of democracy and freedom, while the Soviet Union's Red Bear acted as the antagonist. But Superman didn't need to create an enemy to secure his position. Because in the Marvel Universe, various evil villains would emerge one after another. Before Kang the Conqueror, there was Mr. Sinister. Because of their messy deaths, and the need for confidentiality, he was unable to make it public, and they failed to shoulder this difficult responsibility. Now, it seemed like Apocalypse had become a suitable candidate. Knock, knock. The knock on the door interrupted Luke's thinking and planning. It's really not easy to see you, Director Cavill. Captain America, who returned to Brooklyn, walked into the office with a familiar smile around his lips. He visited SHIELD several times, but most of the time, Luke wasn't even in the office. If you are someone else, you would have to make an appointment at the front desk and wait in line. Faced with Rogers's jokes, Luke also responded with a joke. After Superman returned, he settled the Egyptian mummy problem and took away Set's power. He participated in a secret meeting at the White House and indulged in a little bit of pleasure in a warm embrace. It was only recently that he got back to work, clocking in at SHIELD every day on schedule. With several jobs and very high status, Luke was indeed a very busy man. Compared with the president in the White House, he didn't need to face interviews, participate in political shows, reveal his people-friendly side, and say embarrassing things. The heavy work in other areas wasn't much different. S.H.I.E.L.D. was now a large organization, with agents and spies worldwide, forming a secret intelligence network. The mobilization of tens of thousands of people, as well as various plans for secretly establishing and executing projects, all needed to be reviewed by him. In addition to the above schedule, there were endless meetings in the Pentagon, successive invitations from various interest groups, and so on. If Luke weren't proficient in time management and needed to spend too much time sleeping every day, he would have been overwhelmed. Well, once in a while, he wanted to send warm greetings to Carter, Melina, and others. In this way, Luke was even busier than the president. Ha ha, so should I call you director or general? Rogers drew back his chair, and the secretary outside brought a cup of coffee in time. So, should I call you Captain America or Colonel Rogers? Luke returned his words. The two of them looked at each other and let out a pleasant laugh. After exchanging a few pleasantries and adjusting the atmosphere, Luke went straight to the point and asked, "What did you get out of your time in the Soviet Union?" Captain America was supposed to go to Moscow to find Bucky's whereabouts, but he hurried back to New York because Superman had disappeared. I confirmed Bucky fell into the hands of Leviathan after a round of struggle with the agents of the Red Room. The entire city of Moscow is under KGB surveillance, but in reality, the real one in control of everything is the Red Room and Leviathan behind it. Colonel Rogers's face looked somber. It wasn't long before he lurked in Moscow and was noticed by agents from the Red Room. He almost fell in love with the other and became a prisoner of Leviathan. It sounds thrilling and exciting, like the plot of a secret agent movie. Luke smiled. Speaking of which, he was preparing to fight against Hydra. It wasn't easy for him to free up his hand, just to finish that quest. Side quests, the arrival of a new era, the rebirth of Hydra. After scanning the quest list, Luke was quite excited. The reward was a Kryptonian spaceship. If he unlocked it, exchanged it, and carried out a replication project, maybe in a few decades, the Earth would enter an era of interstellar colonization. To say the least, owning a spaceship capable of wormhole jumps was a good thing for Superman, who wanted to conquer the Starry Sea. Steve, have you ever thought about the fact that Bucky has been in Leviathan's hands for so long? Maybe he's no longer the old friend we know. Luke collected his thoughts and started to prepare Captain America mentally. In case he met the brainwashed Winter Soldier, Rogers would definitely suffer a big loss. He might actually become a cold-blooded killer, an emotionless tool, or a machine. Luke was earnest as he reminded him. The smile on Rogers's face slightly froze. This was something that he didn't want to think about. If one day, he and Bucky were on opposite sides and had to be enemies, what would he do? Captain America's moral bottom line certainly wouldn't tolerate Bucky's indiscriminate killing of innocent people covered in blood. But he couldn't possibly kill his former best friend, placing righteousness above family. This was an extremely difficult choice. If there's such a day, I'll try my best to bring Bucky back. Even if he becomes a jerk, I believe that some things can't be changed. Rogers was silent for a long time and finally said so. This sincere confession simply made Luke want to send tears out to the world. If it weren't for the fact that Captain America had already had a girlfriend and exhibited a normal sexual orientation, he would definitely doubt whether there was some hidden relationship between these two men. It's not that bad. Maybe Bucky is just. On the bright side, at least he's still alive, right? Luke reassured and looked on the bright side. By the way, would you like to join the team and go to Moscow? After hearing the first half of the sentence, Captain America just laughed bitterly, thinking that Luke's method of comforting people was too poor. But when he heard the second half of the sentence, his expression changed, as if he was shocked. Rogers had no idea that Luke would take the initiative to go to Moscow. Unlike when they infiltrated Sicily and conquered Rome. Now he was a lieutenant general, a very high position. The safety and security of this individual could even affect the global situation. At this time, he was taking a personal risk, although no one could threaten Superman. If he went to Moscow, it would undoubtedly add unpredictable risks to his own security. You don't have to do this. Rogers was a little touched. He thought Luke was trying to save Bucky, which was why he left his job and took time off to go to Moscow. I will continue to find Bucky's whereabouts and rescue him. That's my mission. Captain America pursed his lips and spoke earnestly. Bucky and I owe you too much, Luke, whether in Brooklyn or on the battlefield of World War II. There are some responsibilities that I should take up myself. Luke's mouth twitched. He felt that Rogers had misunderstood something. He simply wanted to bring the remnants of Hydra hidden in the Soviet Union together and complete the side quest that offered great rewards. Bucky is also my friend. I have an obligation to save him from Leviathan's hands. After a few seconds of contemplation, Luke stepped back and spoke righteously. Colonel Rogers, you only need to follow orders. Captain America's face looked tense. After a few seconds, he stood up and looked at Luke, who wasn't joking. Yes, sir. Rogers saluted. On the other side of the world, Baron Strucker, the leader of Hydra, sneezed. He rubbed his nose and habitually complained about the weather in Moscow. Mr. Sinister died in Superman's hands, but we obtained his cloning technology. Baron Strucker held his arms around his chest, looked out the window at the Red Square, and confidently said, "This country will soon fall into my hands. The Hydra flag will replace the red." Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 23 comments. Vote. Chapter 347, Chapter 344 Red Room, Black Widow. Hydra, as the villain of the Marvel Universe, was an evergreen tree and a professional blame-taking organization. Adhering to the basic principle of doing things behind the scenes and never keeping one's peace. Even if their leader, Red Skull, had gone on a vacation to an alien planet. Even if the alliance of the Axis powers collapsed and Berlin was defeated. Even if there was Superman to deter the world. But no matter how serious the situation was, the remnants were led by Baron Strucker. They were still trying to overcome the difficulties and strive to complete the mission of becoming the villains. This conscientious and diligent work attitude was simply touching. At this time, Baron Strucker didn't know that a big red word, danger, had appeared on Hydra's head. He didn't even know that some Superman was planning to attack him personally. He was ambitious, wanting to draw nourishment from the red bear that stood on the snowy plains and developed in silence. With the strength of this superpower, a new Hydra empire would be established. This country is like a giant with two legs of different lengths. It will fall down one day sooner or later. Baron Strucker held his monocle and looked at the red square outside the window. All we have to do is wait. Wait for the collapse of the Red Empire, and then revive our great empire on its corpse. Hydra, under his leadership, reached a cooperative relationship with Leviathan, their former nemesis. The latter was also a long-established and ancient organization, named after the biblical symbol of the evil sea monster. After the changes in the times, the power changed. Leviathan's original goals had been blurred and transformed into a tool in the hands of ambitious and conniving individuals. They had early roots in Tsarist Russia, and the assassinations of Peter III and Ivan the Great were all linked to Leviathan. This was probably the reason why both organizations used sea monsters as their icons. Between Leviathan and Hydra, there was a big disagreement. Both sides liked to hide behind their countries and play political games to influence the world by manipulating the top echelons. In World War II, Hydra chose the axis of evil, Germany, and that mustached Führer. On the other hand, Leviathan put all their chips on the Allied front and took a fancy to the Soviet Union, which had done so well in the Great Patriotic War and was incredibly resilient. Leviathan proved to be slightly better than Hydra in terms of investment insight. With the disappearance of Red Skull, Hydra's main forces collapsed. Later on, General Sankt in Berlin made 3 Aryan supermen in an attempt to recover from the defeat of the Axis. But it was still useless. The real Superman wasn't on their side. The fate of a country depended on the efforts of individuals, as well as on the progress of history. After the loss of Hydra, the loss of the Fuhrer, and the loss of the Aryan supermen, Germany was doomed to fail. After all, this wasn't the world of the man in the high castle. Leviathan's people don't think so. They hope that the Soviet Union will smash America into the dust and become the world's only superpower. In a well-heated room, the first-generation Baron Zemo sneered. In response to Superman, Leviathan secretly pushed the Soviet Union to start a body modification program. For example, the Red Guardian was a project started to reproduce the Super Soldier, Captain America. On the surface, it was to get a warrior as powerful as Captain America. But Zemo knew that every country wanted to have its own Superman. The only information that could be confirmed so far was that before Superman appeared, he participated in the US military's Super Soldier program and was injected with a serum developed by Dr. Abraham Erskine. As for why there was such a big gap between Captain America and Superman, the outside world could only blame the different effects of the serum on individuals and some variations in the details. Superman's existence in this world is a miracle. Baron Strucker said so as he thought of Superman, who appeared in Paris like a god. And miracles are often impossible to replicate. Zemo nodded in agreement, with a trace of gloom in his eyes. There was no doubt that Superman was the sword of Damocles, hanging over the heads of every country. No one knew when it would fall, just as no one knew when Superman would break through the ceiling and appear in front of them. Baron, after my long observation of Superman, Zemo's voice sounded a little annoyed through the mask. He's completely different from Captain America. Captain America, Steve Rogers, has some strong beliefs, like the flag, like freedom, and morality. But Superman, although many people call him a beacon of light, he does not belong to any particular side, judging from his past actions. The first-generation Zemo was the backbone of Hydra's remnant party and also Baron Strucker's confidant. He was mainly responsible for intelligence work and often fought with the agents from SHIELD in a battle of wits and espionage. Superman, Captain America, Howard Stark. They were the focus of Hydra's attention. Zemo was like an avid fan and had seen all of Superman's videos and public speeches. Combined with his post-World War II exploits, he tentatively concluded that Luke Cavill, the Pentagon's youngest lieutenant general, seemed more like an opportunist. You mean Superman can be pulled in by Hydra? Baron Strucker frowned. If Superman joins Hydra, what should I do? Retire. There's no way to pull him in, and Hydra has no bargaining chips that could move him. Zemo shook his head. The other party had reached his peak in terms of power and prestige. I think that there are some old-fashioned but practical ways to do this. Superman isn't a god after all. He would still have feelings. Baron Strucker seemed to understand what Zemo meant, and his expression turned a bit odd. Honey trap. Isn't it too outdated? The bald Baron who led Hydra's remnant party found it hard to believe that the high and mighty Superman would be interested in women. We can have a try. I can't find any opening in Superman except for the gossip and scandal in his personal life. Zemo said helplessly. If one couldn't solve the problem by violent means, then one could only adopt a soft approach. Baron Strucker was skeptical. He wasn't good with women himself. Apart from power and ambition to fill his empty heart, everything else was dispensable. Thinking that people were like him, Baron Baldhead subconsciously believed that Superman should also be a puritanical ruler. Wouldn't it be more attractive to rule the world and build great achievements than to roll in the sheets? These days, there weren't many people who had pure ambitions like Baron Strucker. With so many female agents in Leviathan's Red Room, it might be a good idea to find a better Sparrow. Zemo suggested. Baron Strucker was indecisive. He thought for a few minutes and nodded in agreement. Although he wasn't optimistic about Zemo's plan, it wouldn't hurt to give it a try. Anyway, Hydra and Leviathan reached a cooperation. The former shared the research data of the Super Soldier Serum, and the latter provided shelter. I'll talk to Taras to pick a suitable candidate. Baron Strucker spoke in a deep voice. Taras was the leader of the Red Room and one of the most reputable master spy. The KGB, known as the National Security Council of the Soviet Union, was established and organized by him. Later, Taras retired behind the scenes and took over the Red Room, a spy training institution attached to Leviathan. Every Black Widow has been mentored and trained by him. Taras would be happy to take on this challenge. Zemo chuckled. Red Room's Black Widow is so well known that even Captain America almost got caught up in the game. Maybe they could really cheat Superman and complete the task. In a red building located in the mountains, a bearded middle-aged man with tough facial features and a mustache put down his phone. Against Superman. He slightly frowned and took out a file from the drawer to his right. His fingers flipped through the pages as if looking for something. Every page was personal information, with a photo of a young girl attached to each page. They had immature faces and innocent eyes. The Soviet Union became one of the winners of World War II, but at the cost of more than 26 million lives. The war broke countless families. Many children had become orphans. Every year, the Red Room would select some children and train them to become spies and agents. Among them, there were men and women. The males would be given the code-named Raven and the females would be given the code-name Sparrow. What they did most often was to act as spies and conduct espionage. Most of them adopted the honey trap to lure their targets and make them unknowingly disclose high-level secrets. At the same time, they would blackmail, buy or turn people against each other with some pornographic evidence. Those Hydra fools, they think they can gain Superman's trust by sending a woman there. Thinking of what Baron Strucker said on the phone, the master spy named Taras showed a disdainful smile at the amateurs. For the kind of low-level spying above, just give it to the KGB. What the Red Room could accomplish was the more difficult infiltration, concealment, and assassination. Claire. Taras's fingers stopped flipping through the files and gazed at a blonde girl. This was the first Black Widow of the Red Room, a world-class ballet dancer, and a respected artist. This was only her superficial identity. Secretly, she was actually the #1 spy in the Red Room, a socialite trained by Taras. Specializing in the upper echelons of the Soviet Union, as well as celebrities outside, she held the secrets of many dignitaries. Relying on the Black Widow, Leviathan completed the infiltration into the Soviet Union and stole power. She has appeared in public too many times. Taras thought for a moment and shook his head. Familiar faces were too inconvenient for him to use in a plan, and a romantic encounter between a ballet dancer and Superman wasn't attractive enough. He kept turning. E. Grover. Tara saw a girl in a red dress with a stunning look. "I need someone a little younger, preferably a newcomer." The e-Grover in the photo belonged to the glamorous type, which could arouse the hormones of any male creature, but it couldn't completely arouse a man's desire to protect. He kept scrolling and went to the last page. Talas raised his mouth and whispered, "Romanova." In the photo, there was a young girl with long red hair, both young and attractive, like a budding flower. "That's her." Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. Comment. 29 comments. Vote. Chapter 348, Chapter 345 Direction of the script, 2 spies. A beauty scheme against Superman began unfolding under Taras's careful design. Leviathan, behind the Red Room, worked together with Hydra. They set the stage in Moscow, and the show was scheduled for the Red Square conference a week later. A dialogue between the Western camp, represented by the United States, and the Eastern camp, represented by the Soviet Union, about the Cuban regime. At that time, Superman would attend. It was the best time to carry out the plan. Although actively provoked by Kang the Conqueror, the signs of the Cold War were a little earlier than before. However, at this time, the Warsaw Pact wasn't officially established yet. The Red Bear and Bald Eagle didn't completely fall out and enter a state of war. The two superpowers, who could barely maintain basic courtesy, hadn't reached the point where they were about to fight, rolling up their sleeves. In fact, the short-lived peace was due to the return of Superman. It was he who acted as the boundary of peace between the Eastern and Western camps. The White House was unable to use Superman as a strategic weapon to intimidate the East. Despite many hints from the president, Luke remained indifferent. For example, keywords such as world domination and soul hegemony were automatically blocked. While the Soviets were wary, they could only keep trying at the edge of danger. But they were too afraid to cross the bottom line for fear of provoking Superman. If they followed this trajectory, they would continue to develop. The sprout of a Cold War might have been nipped in the bud. Of course, the premise was Superman would always be around and wouldn't show any preference or position. Unknowingly, Luke had become an important factor in the stability of the world. Clark Kent, welcome to Moscow. A few days later, Luke walked out of Domodedovo International Airport, and the receptionist greeted him. That's right, he wore those Clark Kent glasses, and automatically assumed a disguise, a brand new image of a tall, sunny-looking man with a pinch of curly hair. His current status was Superman's secretary. "Miss, what should I call you?" He arrived in the capital city of Moscow in style as Captain America's colleague. Because that face was too flashy, plus the extremely conspicuous American ass, exaggerated pectoral muscles. They could only sneak in secretly and wait for a rendezvous. Dominika E. Grover. The blonde told him her name. She was tall and beautiful. There was a mature style in her gestures. "Hello, Miss E. Grover." Luke took a brief glance. The mature lady who came to the reception was wearing a beige trench coat, a winter hat, blonde hair, and beautiful skin, which was extremely charming. "I wonder if she belongs to the Red Room or KGB." At the moment when Miss E. Grover appeared, he realized that she wasn't an ordinary person. No matter how good the disguise may be, as long as they had been trained, it would leave traces. So, in front of Luke, who had supervision, Miss E. Grover had too many flaws. The extremely flexible, charming body and the strength in her limbs couldn't be hidden from his eyes. "You can just call me by my first name." E. Grover smiled sweetly as she pulled open the car door for Luke. "Okay. Nice to meet you." Luke got into the car and nodded with a smile. "Who is this?" He leaned back and found that the driver was also a woman. Compared to E. Grover, the other side looked a little more mature. The brows and eyes revealed a charming grace. Like a ripe peach, you can't help but want to take a bite and taste the plumpness and sweetness of the juice in your heart. Peaced. Something isn't right. Luke's heart thumped. Where did my disguise go wrong? I just got off the plane in Moscow and was targeted by two beautiful spies. Excuse me, what kind of experience is this? I'm just an ordinary secretary. If Luke used his real identity, Red Room and KGB would call up more than 200 beauties. But he was currently Clark Kent, just a little handsome curly-haired man. There was no need to invest so much, right? "Hello, Mr. Kent." The female driver's eyes were shifting, as if with electricity, causing a little tingling. That's the beauty of a mature woman. All it took was a look, and someone could get a slight hard-on as a sign of respect. Luke, a veteran driver who had seen a lot of scenes and was well versed in all kinds of positions, didn't lose his cool and calmly asked, "Before I came to Moscow, everyone said that the most beautiful scenery in the city was in the Kremlin and Arbat Street. Now, it seems that this isn't the case. I don't believe those two places could be more charming than the two ladies sitting in this car." The female driver covered her mouth with a smile and revealed her name. "I'm clairvoyant. You can call me Claire." She winked at Luke with a playful demeanor. After chatting on the way, Luke roughly understood the surface identities of the two women accompanying him. Claire was a ballerina and an internationally renowned collector. Her husband, an aviator, was killed in a rocket test. In this Red Square conference, Claire was the organizer and was responsible for the reception, so she worked as a driver for Luke. And E. Grover's origin was even more remarkable. Her uncle worked in the Foreign Affairs Bureau, studied piano at St. Petersburg State University, and had held several concerts. It feels like the Red Room's routine. Luke secretly lamented while chatting and laughing. This accidental encounter was like Taras's tailor-made script. Before he left for Moscow, S.H.I.E.L.D. integrated all known information about the Red Room and submitted it to the desk of the director. One of the most impressive was the master spy, Taras. This guy was a self-proclaimed director and would write a script each time he targeted someone. In his words, it could arouse the emotions of prey and make them slowly walk into a trap. But, shouldn't Taras's goal be Superman? Luke was a little confused. What about Superman? The two women sitting in the car didn't look like Sparrow spies that were casually developed. The way they talked, their temperament, looks, and appearance all belonged to the top list. The two dangerous bombs wrapped in sugar coating were used against a secretary. Wasn't it a bit excessive? In the midst of his thoughts, Luke arrived at the hotel where he was staying. Before he could say goodbye and bid farewell, the two ladies who accompanied him stepped to his left and right. "The reception team is also staying here, so E. Grover and I will show you to your reserved room." Claire ruffled her long hair and walked inside while holding Luke's arm. E. Grover followed suit with a shallow smile on her face. The group of three attracted a lot of attention, from envy, a surprise to speculation. This is simply blatant seduction. Luke was a bit speechless and began to consider whether to be a carefree man or to keep to himself and lick a bit of the icing. although the purpose of this trip was to infiltrate Hydra and rescue Bucky in the process. However, having wonderful encounters that occurred during the trip was still acceptable and reasonable. Sweet dreams, Mr. Kent. He went up the elevator to the 22nd floor and walked all the way to the door of the room. The two beautiful ladies, who were overly enthusiastic, finally stopped. One leaned against the wall, her hands behind her back, and the beautiful legs with stockings gently touched the carpet. Her beautiful eyes blinked as if releasing some kind of signal. Who could stand it? Luke was determined to sacrifice himself and feed the tiger. To find out Bucky's whereabouts, there was always a price to pay. He said to himself, "Would you ladies like to come in for a cup of coffee? Or vodka? I'm new to Moscow, and I don't have any friends here." Luke was straightforward with his invitation. Men and women from all over the world who were planning to have in-depth communication. Their common opening line would be, "Do you want to come over to my house for a while, or come over for a cup of coffee?" This was a non-technical and relatively straightforward invitation. But Luke tried to act like a rookie, his eyes darting as if he was embarrassed. Perhaps it was the incidental effect of the glasses that fooled the two female spies, who had been professionally trained by the Red Room. They were secretly laughing at the bottom of their hearts. It's been a long time since they had met such a naive man. Thinking of what the instructor, Taras, said, in order to complete the mission, they had to do whatever it took. The two felt that the rookie was new to the country. They didn't even need to sacrifice their bodies, just give him a little sweetness. And he would reveal everything he knew. "E. Grover, what do you think?" As a mature woman, Claire didn't directly respond but kicked the question to her colleague. Before getting down to business, they needed to whet the appetite of these men and arouse their inner restlessness. In this way, the men would take the initiative, and they would have a better chance of achieving their goals. "Mr. Kent looks a little nervous. I think I should talk with him." E. Grover wiggled her waist and strolled into the room. Claire pretended to hesitate and waited for a few seconds before following. "Thank you for your kindness." Luke turned on the heating and lighting. The spacious and comfortable suite soon warmed up. He fumbled out a bottle of vodka from the wine cabinet and began to pour it for the two ladies. A trace of contempt swept under the latter's eyes. They couldn't remember how many times they had met this kind of routine, getting drunk and doing whatever they wanted. Alcohol immunization was one of the training courses in the Red Room. Not to mention a bottle of vodka, Claire and E. Grover wouldn't feel the slightest bit intoxicated if even more alcohol was poured into them. "Get this guy drunk and throw him to the KGB. If necessary, you can give him a taste and let him volunteer to become Red Room's spy." Two female spies inadvertently looked at each other and exchanged ideas through their eyes. In their view, everything was under control. Binge. Read next 60 chapters on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/binge translations. Please vote this novel by visiting the novel page, in case you don't see vote button here. // Comment. 18 comments. Vote. Chapter 349, Chapter 346 Miserably whoring, sent to the door. This is the most humiliating move in the history of the Red Room. The next afternoon, Taras flew into a furious rage in the office, and the angry roar shook the whole floor. The instructors who were anxious and the students who were training looked up with a hint of shock in their eyes. Yelling was an extremely rare display for Taras, who was usually calm and collected. Anger is a disguise for one's own mediocrity. This was a phrase that the master spy often said. The first lesson of the Red Room was a lesson on controlling one's expression and internal thoughts. Emotions were a fatal flaw for agents and spies. Once caught in anger and fear, it would affect decision-making and implementation of their operations. Before graduation, the students in the Red Room would receive relevant training. For example, Taras would let everyone keep a dog. Cultivate intimate feelings, regard them as partners, and then execute them. It was just pediatrics. What was more cruel and devoid of humanity was the graduation ceremony of the Red Room. Throwing the trainees into the snow, leaving only 1 or 2 pieces of survival materials to create a bloody battlefield of killing each other. Finally, the person who could successfully get out of the snowfield could become a qualified graduate. Agent and spy training were essential tools to domesticate human beings into cold machines. Therefore, Taras would instill in them the extreme idea of doing things by hook or by crook. What happened? I don't know. I heard that Mr. Taras sent Black Widow Clairvoyant and the Best Sparrow Grover before. Did they fail the mission? Probably. Who could get the Red Room to mobilize both of them? Whispering, like an undercurrent flowing slowly under the calm surface of the sea, it formed a thick wave. Even if the Red Room were an intelligence agency, it would always stay in a cold and stressful, high-pressure state. But there would always be curiosity, and gossips would spread. The instructors and students downstairs were speculating, while the atmosphere in the office upstairs was gloomy. You are the best students I've ever taught, and no matter what the task, you have never failed. Taras tightened his eyebrows, pressed down his anger, and coldly said, infiltrating the Kremlin, moving between the oligarchs and military VIPs, each time, you bring back the information I need. He seemed to have lost his temper, calmed his heaving chest, and slowly sat back in his chair. Claire and Grover stood across the desk. With their hands behind their backs, the 2 charming beauties maintained a straight and beautiful military stance. I never imagined that the 2 best seductresses to ever come out of the Red Room would be bamboozled by a secretary. Tara's mouth twitched, trying to endure the urge to swear. The external evaluation of him basically carries words like scavenging vulture, cunning fox, and cold-blooded butcher. The middle-aged man who single-handedly created the KGB and later built the Red Room had maintained a grim, unsmiling image throughout the years. There weren't many things that could make him lose his temper and fly into a rage. Today, however, Taras couldn't bear this anger. This was an accident. Grover, backed by her uncle in the Foreign Affairs Bureau, was bolder and took the lead in saying so. She slightly lowered her head and explained, Claire and I were going to get that bastard drunk and then throw him to the KGB's care for interrogation to see if we could get any information about Superman. He's a secretary, responsible for recording all the meetings' conversations, and was at Superman's side almost 24 hours a day. If we could turn him into a double agent of the Red Room, it would be of great benefit for the future implementation of the plan. Grover's thinking was clear, and Claire, the Black Widow next to her, also nodded. They did think so, but the execution went a bit awry. It sounds like a good idea. Taras slightly nodded and seemed to express understanding. However, the relaxed look only lasted for a moment before it disintegrated. The master spy then angrily looked at Grover and questioned, but why did you get into bed with that damned secretary? And both together. The Red Room cultivates the best agents, not those street girls. Beauty and body are tools, but not cheap coupons that can be thrown away at will. Taras slapped the table. He couldn't control his emotions at all. 2 good students who trained by him had been ruined by a bastard. If the other party was Superman or some big shot. Through this special relationship, the Red Room could exchange interests or get the desired information. At least there wouldn't be a loss in the sale. But that's just a secretary. No real power, no value, nothing. If not for fear of attracting S.H.I.E.L.'s attention by shaking the grass and spooking the prey. Taras wanted to break the hands and feet of the curly-haired man who had ruined his students, throw him into an iron barrel, fill it with cement and sink him in the Moscow River. The way the Red Room handled the enemy was much more brutal and direct than the KGB's ruthless people. Forget about only one, you two actually went in together. Taras went into a rage and couldn't restrain his anger. This was like 2 cabbages that he had toiled so hard to grow, was somehow being spoiled by someone, and it was still that kind of whoring. Who could stand it? That bastard kept acting like he was about to get drunk. Claire felt aggrieved. She remembered that in the hotel room, the bastard had downed 2 glasses, had drunken eyes, slurred speech, completely like a rookie with little capacity for liquor. As a result, the bottle dried up, and he remained the same. 2 bottles were bottomed out, and he still remained that way. 3, then 4 bottles were poured out. By the time the liquor cabinet was completely emptied and the room smelled so strongly of alcohol, Claire and E. Grover had become drunk themselves. The Red Room female agents, who received alcohol immunization training, abruptly lost to a secretary who looked like a rookie. The key is that he also threw out some important information from time to time. What Superman's schedule was, Superman's preference for food, we could only keep drinking in order to get more information. E. Grover, codenamed Sparrow, gritted her teeth and spat out her hatred. Her highly flexible waist was still sore. When she thought of herself in bed, she was sometimes positioned below, sometimes up top, and various positions were unlocked one after another. The female agent couldn't help but feel some shame, and her cheeks flushed unnaturally. That's right. That bastard Clark Kent is no rookie at all. Claire's slender legs, which could dance Swan Lake and the Nutcracker, were slightly weak. The truth was, the battle last night was too intense. That bastard was driving 2 BMWs left and right. It was surprising to see his calm and relaxed attitude. Alcohol was the devil that provoked the desire, which was absolutely true. In the past, Claire wouldn't have indulged like this. So, you slept with the secretary and got nothing. Taras shook his head in disappointment. Maybe, we can play along and continue our plans with the secretary. E. Grover proposed. Humph. Isn't being humiliated once enough? Taras immediately vetoed the idea. He never invested time and energy in worthless targets. Besides, the best students in the Red Room weren't that cheap. If word got out, he would be laughed at. I am the head of a spy agency, not a pimp. Taras said so in an unpleasant tone. He waved and motioned for Claire and E. Grover to go out. Then, he picked up the phone on the desk. Call Natasha in. Within a few minutes, a slender, ponytailed girl walked in. Compared to the 2 fellow sisters, she appeared much more youthful, like a flower that had just started to bud. You are graduating early, Natasha. Taras said solemnly. The latter was slightly surprised, with suspicion in her eyes. I've only just been recruited to the Red Room for a short period of time. How did I graduate? She hadn't even seen the legendary harsh and brutal graduation exams yet. I need you to get close to someone. The young girl took a file and opened it. A young face came into view. It was Superman. He will arrive in Moscow in 3 days. Tara's thought that the two elder sisters were too unreliable. Natasha, a newcomer, might be more useful. At least, the latter wouldn't be coaxed to bed by a man with a few bottles of vodka. I will try to complete the mission, Natasha said timidly. She was still a nestling bird with no experience in hunting. You don't need to be experienced. Just act natural. Tara's appeased. Sometimes the untrained were more effective than the professionals. After giving instructions, Tara's let the girl go. Despite the incident, the plan went on as usual. As for the curly-haired male secretary named Clark, he would first wait until all the dust settled, then make his move. I'll drown him in the Moscow River. Tara's thought so. This is how you deal with Red Room agents. Captain America, who sneaked into Moscow, looked at the messy sheets, the carpet, and the bottles scattered on the table and asked hesitantly. Luke, who had been fighting all night, didn't answer. The director of SHIELD had sex with a female Soviet agent, which wasn't something to be proud of. I paid a certain price and found Bucky's whereabouts from their mouths. Luke changed the subject. Under the influence of his poison ivy's phenomenon perfume, even the top agents of the Red Room had to drop their defenses. Oh, where's Bucky? Sure enough, whenever his best friend was mentioned, Captain America's attention would immediately be diverted, no longer thinking about what happened between Luke and female agents. You will see each other soon. Luke had an odd expression. To be honest, he was a bit surprised by Winter Soldier's situation. Comment. 15 comments. Vote. Chapter 350, Chapter 347 Hydra First Stallion, Hitman, and Pawn. Bucky only showed up once at the beginning, and then he always lived in Captain America's memory, according to Luke's words. He seemed to have much worse luck than his two friends, who were also from Brooklyn. He went to war with patriotic enthusiasm, but not long afterward, he was captured by Hydra in a failed attack. According to the original plot, Bucky should have been tortured and experimented on and was finally saved by Captain America. The two of them look at each other in the sea of fire and uttered similar lines to those in the movie Titanic. Bucky, get out of here. Don't worry about me. No. I won't leave you, Steve. And so on and so forth. In the follow-up, Bucky accidentally fell off a cliff, and Rogers acted out an emotional drama scene. This was a successful conclusion, and they would see each other again after 70 years. However, it may be due to the butterfly effect of a certain guy who had wandered into the set. It affected the normal development of the world. Not only did the Axis powers create Aryan supermen, but it also changed Bucky's fate. He couldn't wait for his best friend and was moved to another place by Hydra. After a few twists and turns, he fell into Baron Strucker's hands and became a cold-blooded killing machine. If that was all, then Bucky was merely bringing forward Winter Soldier's grim fate. But who would have thought that Baron Strucker would meet up with General Sangt and cooperate with him? Bucky, who was chosen as a test subject, successfully survived 24 transformations. Hydra's Aryan Superman was born. The genetic modification was obviously much more powerful than the increase in strength brought by the robotic arm. Bucky's status had been changed as a result of the enhancements. From the original ace killer, he was promoted to Baron Strucker's personal bodyguard and Hydra's #1 hitman. What's the difference between the two? The former was expendable cannon fodder, and the rarity varied when he died. The latter was a close confidant and wouldn't be rashly sacrificed by Baron Strucker, as long as it wasn't the last resort. Simply put, his personal safety was taken care of. What did you say? Captain America suddenly stood up, his face gloomy. As a moral and spiritual champion, Steve Rogers was mostly gentle and hardly ever lost his temper with others. But after hearing Luke's explanation of Bucky's plight, his eyes burst with blazing light. If the violent energy erupted, the whole room would be reduced to ruins. Calm down, Steve. Luke didn't seem to expect such a strong reaction from Captain America, so he quickly offered reassuring words. Sure enough, as long as Bucky was involved, Rogers could hardly keep his cool. This was probably some kind of special bond. Damn Hydra. I'll send them all to hell. Taking a few deep breaths, and the flamboyant pectoral muscles fluctuated. Captain America finally calmed down, and the blazing white lightning that lingered on his body slowly dissipated. He was tense, his face unchanged, and he made a harsh statement. Well, it seemed that he would completely turn into Hydra's nemesis this time. On the bright side, Bucky is at least alive. There is no danger. Luke patted the other on the shoulder. After an in-depth exchange with the two Red Room female agents, he vaguely heard some information about Bucky. It was well known that under the brainwashing of the mustached Farah, up to the top and down to the civilians, a lot of people were fanatics about bloodlines. Only pure Aryans were qualified to rule the world. After Bucky successfully survived the 24 transformations, Hydra began to consider replication work. If they could have an army of Aryan supermen, who could stop them? General Sankt was buried underground in Berlin with Woden's blood and research data. Trying to reverse engineer Brood's biotechnology took a lot of time, involved a lot of effort, and didn't always pay off. The biggest headache was the lack of clues and the inability to make a breakthrough. So, Baron Strucker came up with a clumsy way to do it. He regarded Bucky as a stallion and had him have intercourse with recruited adult women. The requirement was blonde hair and blue eyes so that the purity of the blood was guaranteed. First of all, Bucky, as a battleship class, was full of energy and excellent genes, so he was a qualified stallion. If the seeds were successfully sown, according to genetics, the babies born would most likely be stronger. At the age of 15 or 16, this group would be injected with the defective serum copied from Bucky's. Although it took a long time, it was feasible. As far as it was known, the project had only reached the first stage of development for the time being. In other words, the breeding step. That was why Captain America was so rude. The thought of Bucky having sex with different blondes on a daily basis made Rogers's heart pound with anger. What a miserable life that was. His best friend, like a tireless stallion, was circulating among those sultry bitches, taking turns on him. Monotonous and boring, tedious and torturous. Everywhere he looked, he would see a lot of lust. It was terrible. Rogers was shaking with anger just imagining it and felt sorry for Bucky. This is trampling on Bucky's dignity and an insult to his character. Captain America was distraught. He couldn't wait to rescue his good friend so that he could escape from the evil hell of blonde hair and silky skin. You don't know how many men want to be trampled on and humiliated in this way. Luke silently thought so. There was no shame in being a stallion for Hydra. The racist extremists have a high threshold for selecting breeding women. All of them should be blonde and beautiful. Moreover, in order to prevent Bucky's body from being drained and hollowed out, Baron Strucker also arranged a nutritionist team to customize his menu. When he was not on a mission, Bucky spent his days eating and drinking well, preparing for output. Speaking of which, the only thing that made Luke think that Hydra was out of their minds. As racists, a group of people who emphasized Aryan ancestry, they actually found an American to breed with. Thus, what supreme lineage? It was all lip service. Then we will completely wipe out Hydra and Leviathan next. Luke cleared his throat and seriously said so. But, first, you have to stay calm and don't be impulsive. The angry Captain America was silent for a moment and nodded in agreement. He couldn't come up with a better plan for the time being and had to follow Superman's orders. So, what do I have to do? Rogers thought about it and thought that he still had to take on some responsibilities. He couldn't leave everything to Luke. Don't worry. I've already assigned you a mission. Luke opened the curtains and looked out over Moscow's scenery. Steve, you're the bait for fishing. A few days later, Superman arrived in Moscow, and there was a welcoming ceremony. The appearance of Captain America would inevitably arouse Hydra and Leviathan's vigilance. Maybe, Bucky was already the Winter Soldier. He might be able to take time out of his busy schedule to talk to an old friend.